and welcome to this course, Create Machine Learning Models in Microsoft Azure. Machine learning is the foundation for predictive modeling and artificial intelligence. In this course, you will learn the core principles of machine learning and how to use common tools and frameworks to train, evaluate, and use machine learning models. This course is comprised of the following modules: Explore data and create models to predict numeric values, Train and evaluate classification and clustering models, and Train and evaluate deep learning models. Let's start with the first module, Explore data and create models to predict numeric values. Data exploration and analysis is at the core of data science. Data scientists require skills and languages like Python to explore, visualize, and manipulate data. In this module, you will use Python to explore, visualize, and manipulate data, describe how regression can be used to create a machine learning model that predicts numeric values, and use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train and evaluate a regression model. In the next module, you will explore how to train and evaluate classification and clustering models. Classification is a kind of machine learning used to categorize items into classes. In this module, you will learn how classification can be used to create a machine learning model that predicts categories or classes. You will use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train and evaluate a classification model. You will also learn how clustering can be used to create unsupervised machine learning models that group data observations into clusters. You will use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train a clustering model. Finally, you will learn how to train and evaluate deep learning models. In this module, you will learn about the fundamental principles of deep learning and how to create deep neural network models using PyTorch or TensorFlow. You will also explore the use of convolutional neural networks to create image classification models. Additionally, throughout this course, you will have an opportunity to explore machine learning models in Microsoft Azure through interactive exercises and real-world examples of data science in action, knowledge checks, and practice exams. We wish you every success as you start this learning journey. Hello! In this lesson, you will learn how to explore and analyze data with Python. Unsurprisingly, the role of a data scientist primarily involves exploring and analyzing data. The results of an analysis might form the basis of a report or a machine learning model, but it all begins with data, with Python being the most popular programming language for data scientists. After decades of open-source development, Python provides extensive functionality with powerful statistical and numerical libraries. NumPy and Pandas simplify analyzing and manipulating data. Matplotlib provides attractive data visualizations. Scikit-learn offers simple and effective predictive data analysis. TensorFlow and PyTorch supply machine learning and deep learning capabilities. Usually, a data analysis project is designed to establish insights around a particular scenario or to test a hypothesis. For example, suppose a university professor collects data from their students, including the number of lectures attended, the hours spent studying, and the final grade achieved on the end-of-term exam. The professor could analyze the data to determine if there is a relationship between the amount of studying a student undertakes and the final grade they achieve. The professor might use the data to test a hypothesis that only students who study for a minimum number of hours can expect to achieve a passing grade. In this lesson, you will learn common data exploration and analysis tasks and explore how to use Python packages like NumPy, Pandas, and Matplotlib to analyze data. In this lesson, you learned how to use Python to explore, visualize, and manipulate data. Data exploration is at the core of data science and is a key element in data analysis and machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of data science that deals with predictive modeling. In other words, machine learning uses data to create predictive models in order to predict unknown values. You might use machine learning to predict how much food a supermarket needs to order, or to identify plants in a photograph. Machine learning works by identifying relationships between data values that describe characteristics of something, its features, such as the height and color of a plant, and the value we want to predict, the label, such as the species of plant. These relationships are built into a model through a training process. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to train and evaluate regression models. Regression is where models predict a number. In machine learning, the goal of regression is to create a model that can predict a numeric quantifiable value, such as a price, amount, size, or other scalar number. Regression is a statistical technique of fundamental importance to science because of its ease of interpretation, robustness, and speed in calculation. Regression models provide an excellent foundation to understanding how more complex machine learning techniques work. In real-world situations, particularly when little data is available, regression models are very useful for making predictions. For example, if a company that rents bicycles wants to predict the expected number of rentals on a given day in the future, a regression model can predict this number. A model could be created using existing data, such as the number of bicycles that were rented on days where the season, day of the week, and so on were also recorded. In this lesson, you will learn when to use regression models and learn how to train and evaluate regression models using the scikit-learn framework. To get the most out of this lesson, you will need some knowledge of basic mathematics and some experience programming in Python. Regression works by establishing a relationship between variables in the data that represent characteristics, known as the features, of the thing being observed, and the variable we are trying to predict, known as the label. Recall our company that rents bicycles and wants to predict the expected number of rentals in a given day. In this case, features include things like the day of the week, month, and so on, while the label is the number of bicycle rentals. To train the model, we start with the data sample containing the features, as well as known values for the label. So in this case, we would need historical data that includes dates, weather conditions, and the number of bicycle rentals. We'll then split this data sample into two subsets: a training dataset to which we apply an algorithm that determines a function encapsulating the relationship between the feature values and the known label values. A validation or test dataset that we can use to evaluate the model by using it to generate predictions for the label and comparing them to the actual known label values. The use of historic data with known label values to train a model makes regression an example of supervised machine learning. Let's take a simple example to see how the training and evaluation process works in principle. Suppose we simplify the scenario so that we use a single feature, the average daily temperature, to predict the bicycle rentals label. We start with some data that includes known values for the average daily temperature feature and the bicycle rentals label. Now we'll randomly select 5 of these observations and use them to train a regression model. When we're talking about training a model, what we mean is finding a function, a mathematical equation, let's call it f, that can use the temperature feature, which we'll call x, to calculate the number of rentals, which we'll call y. In other words, we need to define the following function: f of x equals y. We can then start by plotting the training values for x and y on a chart. Now we need to fit these values to a function, allowing for some random variation. From our example scenario, the plotted points form an almost straight diagonal line. In other words, there's an apparent linear relationship between x and y, so we need to find a linear function that's the best fit for the data sample. There are various algorithms we can use to determine this function, which will ultimately find a straight line with minimal overall variance from the plotted points. The line represents a linear function that can be used with any value of x to apply the slope of the line and its intercept, where the line crosses the y-axis when x is 0, to calculate y. In this case, if we extended the line to the left, we'd find that when x is 0, y is around 20, and the slope of the line is such that for each unit of x you move along to the right, y increases by around 1.7. Our f function, therefore, can be calculated as 20 plus 1.7x. Now that we've defined our predictive function, we can use it to predict labels for the validation data we held back and compare the predictive values with the actual known y values. The predicted values are typically indicated with the symbol y hat. The plotted points that are on the function line are the predicted y hat values calculated by the function, and the other plotted points are the actual y values. There are various ways we can measure the variance between the predicted and actual values, and we can use these metrics to evaluate how well the model predicts. It's important to note that machine learning is based in statistics and math, and it's important to be aware of specific terms that statisticians and mathematicians, and therefore data scientists, use. You can think of the difference between a predicted label value and the actual label value as a measure of error. However, in practice, the actual values are based on sample observations, which themselves may be subject to some random variance. To make it clear that we're comparing a predicted value, y hat, with an observed value, y, and we refer to the difference between them as the residuals. We can summarize the residuals for all of the validation data predictions to calculate the overall loss in the model as a measure of its predictive performance. One of the most common ways to measure the loss is to square the individual residuals, sum the squares, and calculate the mean. Squaring the residuals has the effect of basing the calculation on absolute values, ignoring whether the difference is negative or positive, and giving more weight to larger differences. This metric is called the mean squared error. Returning back to our example, the loss for our model based on the MSE metric is 9.79. So, is that any good? It's difficult to tell if the MSE value is any good as it is not expressed in a meaningful unit of measurement. We do know that the lower the value is, the less loss there is in the model, and therefore the better it is at predicting. This makes it a useful metric to compare two models and find the one that performs best. Sometimes it's more useful to express the loss in the same unit of measurement as the predicted label value itself. In this case, the number of rentals. It's possible to do this by calculating the square root of the MSE, which produces a metric known, unsurprisingly, as the root mean squared error, or RMSE. For example, the square root of 9.79 is 3.13. So our model's RMSE indicates that the loss is just over 3, which you can interpret loosely as meaning that on average, incorrect predictions are wrong by around 3 rentals. There are many other metrics that can be used to measure loss in a regression. For example, R squared, which is sometimes known as coefficient of determination. This is the correlation between x and y squared. This produces a value between 0 and 1 that measures the amount of variance that can be explained by the model. Generally, the closer this value is to 1, the better the model predicts. In this lesson, you learned how regression can be used to create a machine learning model that predicts numeric values. You then use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train and evaluate a regression model. While scikit-learn is a popular framework for writing code to train regression models, you can also create machine learning solutions for regression using the graphical tools in Microsoft Azure Machine Learning. Later, you will learn more about no-code development of regression models using Azure Machine Learning in the Create a Regression Model with Azure Machine Learning Designer module. Hello! In this lesson, you will learn how to train and evaluate classification models. Classification is a form of machine learning in which you train a model to predict which category or class an item belongs to. For example, a health clinic might use diagnostic data such as a patient's height, weight, blood pressure, blood glucose level to predict whether or not the patient is diabetic. Categorical data has distinct classes rather than numeric values. Some kinds of data can be either numeric or categorical. The time to run a race could be a time in seconds, or we could split times into classes of fast, medium, and slow categorical. While other kinds of data can only be categorical, such as the type of shape, for example, circle, triangle, or square. In this lesson, you will learn when to use classification and how to train and evaluate a classification model using the scikit-learn framework. To get the most out of this lesson, it helps if you have some knowledge of basic mathematics and some experience programming in Python. Binary classification is classification with 2 categories. For example, we could label patients as non-diabetic or diabetic. The class prediction is made by determining the probability for each possible class as a value between 0, impossible, and 1, certain. The total probability for all classes is 1, as the patient is definitely either diabetic or non-diabetic. So, if the predicted probability of a patient being diabetic is 0.3, then there is a corresponding probability of 0.7 that the patient is non-diabetic. The threshold value, usually 0.5, is used to determine the predicted class. So if the positive class, in this case diabetic, has a predicted probability greater than the threshold, then a classification of diabetic is predicted. Classification is an example of a supervised machine learning technique, which means it relies on data that includes known feature values, for example, diagnostic measurements for patients, as well as known label values, For example, a classification of non-diabetic or diabetic. A classification algorithm is used to fit a subset of the data to a function that can calculate the probability for each class label from the feature values. The remaining data is used to evaluate the model by comparing the predictions it generates from the features to the known class labels. Let's explore a simple example to help explain the key principles. Suppose we have the following patient data, which consists of a single feature, blood glucose level, and a class label of 0 for non-diabetic and 1 for diabetic. We'll use the first 8 observations to train a classification model, and we'll start by plotting the blood glucose feature, which we'll call X, and the predicted diabetic label, which we'll call Y. What we need is a function that calculates a probability value for Y based on X. In other words, we need the function f of X equals Y. The chart data shows that patients with a low blood glucose level are all non-diabetic, while patients with a higher blood glucose level are diabetic. It seems like the higher the blood glucose level, the more probable it is that a patient is diabetic, with the inflection point being somewhere between 100 and 110. We need to fit a function that calculates a value between 0 and 1 for Y to these values. One such function is a logistic function, which forms a sigmoidal, S-shaped curve. Now we can use the function to calculate a probability value that Y is positive, meaning the patient is diabetic from any value of X by finding the point on the function line for X. We can start a threshold value of 0.5 as the cutoff point for the class label prediction. Let's test it with the data values we held back. Points plotted below the threshold line will yield a predicted class of 0, non-diabetic, and points above the line will be predicted as 1, diabetic. Now we can compare the label predictions based on the logistic function encapsulated in the model Y hat to the actual class labels Y. The predicted values are typically indicated with the symbol Y hat. The training accuracy of a classification model is much less important than how well the model will work when given new, unseen data. After all, we train models so that they can be used on new data we find in the real world. So after we have trained a classification model, we should evaluate how it performs on a set of new, unseen data. In the last lesson, we created a model that would predict whether a patient had diabetes or not based on their blood glucose level. Now, when applied to some data that wasn't part of the training set, we get predictions. Recall that X refers to blood glucose levels, Y refers to whether they're actually diabetic, and Y hat refers to the model's prediction as to whether they're diabetic or not. Simply calculating how many predictions were correct is sometimes misleading or too simplistic for us to understand the kind of errors it will make in the real world. To get more detailed information, we can tabulate the results in a structure called a confusion matrix. The confusion matrix shows the total number of cases where the model predicted 0 and the actual label is 0, true negatives. The model predicted 1 and the actual label is 1, true positives. The model predicted 0 and the actual label is 1, false negatives. The model predicted 1 and the actual label is 0, false positives. The cells in the confusion matrix are often shaded so that higher values have a deeper shade. This makes it easier to see a strong diagonal trend from top left to bottom right, highlighting the cells where the predicted value and actual value are the same. From these core values, you can calculate a range of other metrics that can help you evaluate the performance of the model. For example, accuracy. Of all the predictions, how many were correct? Recall. Of all the cases that are positive, how many did the model identify? Precision. Of all the cases that the model predicted to be positive, how many actually are positive? In this lesson, you learned how classification can be used to create a machine learning model that predicts categories, or classes. You then use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train and evaluate a classification model. While scikit-learn is a popular framework for writing code to train classification models, you can also create machine learning solutions for classification using the graphical tools in Microsoft Azure Machine Learning. You can learn more about no-code development of classification models using Azure Machine Learning Designer. Hello! In this lesson, you will learn how to train and evaluate clustering models. Clustering is the process of grouping objects with similar objects. For example, imagine a scenario where you have a collection of two-dimensional coordinates that have been clustered into 3 categories: yellow, red, and blue. A major difference between clustering and classification models is that clustering is an unsupervised method where training is done without labels. Instead, models identify examples that have a similar collection of features. For example, images that have a similar color are grouped together. Clustering is common and useful for exploring new data where patterns between data points, such as high-level categories, are not yet known. It's used in many fields that need to automatically label complex data, including analysis of social networks, brain connectivity, spam filtering, and so on. Clustering is a form of unsupervised machine learning in which observations are grouped into clusters based on similarities in their data values or features. This kind of machine learning is considered unsupervised because it does not make use of previous known label values to train a model. In a clustering model, the label is the cluster to which the observation is assigned based purely on its features. For example, suppose a botanist observes a sample of flowers and records the number of petals and leaves on each flower. It may be useful to group these flowers into clusters based on similarities between their features. There are many ways this could be done. For example, if most flowers have the same number of leaves, they could be grouped into those with many versus few petals. Alternatively, if both petal and leaf counts vary considerably, there may be a pattern to discover, such as those with many leaves also having many petals. The goal of the clustering algorithm is to find the optimal way to split the dataset into groups. What optimal means depends on both the algorithm used and the dataset that is provided. Although this flower example may be simple for a human to achieve with only a few samples, as the dataset grows to thousands of samples or to more than 2 features, clustering algorithms become very useful to quickly dissect a dataset into groups. In this lesson, you learned how clustering can be used to create unsupervised machine learning models that group data observations into clusters. You then use the scikit-learn framework in Python to train a clustering model. While scikit-learn is a popular framework for writing code to train clustering models, you can also create machine learning solutions for clustering using the graphical tools in Microsoft Azure Machine Learning. You can learn more about no-code development of clustering models with Azure Machine Learning Designer. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to train and evaluate deep learning models. Deep learning is an advanced form of machine learning that tries to emulate the way the human brain learns. In your brain, you have nerve cells called neurons, which are connected to one another by nerve extensions that pass electrical chemical signals through the network. When the first neuron in the network is stimulated, the input signal is processed, and if it exceeds a particular threshold, the neuron is activated and passes the signal on to the neurons in which it is connected. These neurons, in turn, may be activated and pass the signal on through the rest of the network. Over time, the connections between the neurons are strengthened by frequent use as you learn how to respond effectively. For example, if someone throws a ball towards you, your neuron connections enable you to process the visual information and coordinate your movements to catch the ball. If you perform this action repeatedly, the network of neurons involved in catching a ball will grow stronger as you learn how to be better at catching a ball. Deep learning emulates this biological process using artificial neural networks that process numeric inputs rather than electrochemical stimuli. The incoming nerve connections are replaced by numeric inputs that are typically identified as X. When there's more than one input value, X is considered a vector with elements named X1, X2, and so on. Associated with each X value is a weight, W, which is used to strengthen or weaken the effect of the X value to simulate learning. Additionally, a bias, B, input is added to enable fine-grained control over the network. During the training process, the W and B values will be adjusted to tune the network so that it learns to produce correct outputs. The neuron itself encapsulates a function that calculates a weighted sum of X, W, and B. This function is in turn enclosed in an activation function that constrains the result, often to a value between 0 and 1, to determine whether or not the neuron passes an output onto the next layer of neurons in the network. Before exploring how to train a deep neural network or DNN machine learning model, let's consider what we're trying to achieve. Machine learning is concerned with predicting a label based on some features of a particular observation. In simple terms, a machine learning model is a function that calculates y, the label, from x, the features, f of x equals y. For example, suppose your observation consists of some measurements of a penguin, Specifically, the measurements are the length of the penguin's bill, the depth of the penguin's bill, the length of the penguin's flipper, and the penguin's weight. In this case, the features x are a vector of 4 values, or mathematically, x equals x1, x2, x3, x4. Let's suppose that the label we're trying to predict, y, is the species of the penguin, and that there are 3 possible species it could be: 0, an Adeline, 1, a Gentoo, or 2, a chinstrap. This is an example of classification problem in which the machine learning model must predict the most predictable class to which the observation belongs. A classification model accomplishes this by predicting a label that consists of the probability for each class. In other words, y is a vector of 3 probability values, one for each of the possible classes. Y equals P0, P1, P2. You train the machine learning model by using observations for which you already know the true label. For example, you may have the following feature measurements for an Adelie specimen: x equals 37.3, 16.8, 19.2, and 30.0. You already know that this is an example of an Adelie class 0. So a perfect classification function should result in a label that indicates 100% probability for class 0 and 0% probability for classes 1 and 2. In this case, y equals 1, 0, and 0. So how would we use deep learning to build a classification model for the penguin classification model? Let's look at an example. The deep neural network model for the classifier consists of multiple layers of artificial neurons. In this case, there are 4 layers. An input layer with a neuron for each expected input, or x, value. 2 so-called hidden layers, each containing 5 neurons. An output layer containing 3 neurons, one for each class probability, or y value, to be predicted by the model. Because of the layered architecture of the network, this kind of model is sometimes referred to as a multi-layer perceptron. Additionally, all neurons in the input and hidden layers are connected to all neurons in the subsequent layers. This is an example of a fully connected network. When you create a model like this, you must define an input layer that supports the number of features your model will process, and an output layer that reflects the number of outputs you expect it to produce. You can decide how many hidden layers you want to include and how many neurons are in each of them, but you have no control over the input and output values for these layers. These are determined by the model training process. The training process for a deep neural network consists of multiple interactions called epochs. For the first epoch, you start by assigning random initialization values for the weight, W, and bias, B, values. Then the process is as follows. Features for data observations with known labeled values are submitted to the input layer. Generally, these observations are grouped into batches, often referred to as mini-batches. The neurons then apply their function and, if activated, pass the result on to the next layer until the output layer produces a prediction. The prediction is compared to the actual known value, and the amount of variance between the predicted and true values, which we call the loss, is calculated. Based on the results, revised values for the weights and bias values are calculated to reduce the loss, and these adjustments are back-propagated to the neurons in the network layers. The next epoch repeats the batch training forward pass with the revised weight and bias values, hopefully improving the accuracy of the model by reducing the loss. It's important to note that processing the training features as a batch improves the efficiency of the training process by processing multiple observations simultaneously as a matrix of features with vectors of weights and biases. Linear algebraic functions that operate with matrices and vectors also feature in 3D graphic processing, which is why computers with graphic processing units, or GPUs, provide significantly better performance for deep learning model training than central processing units or CPU-only computers. Okay, let's take a closer look at loss functions and backpropagation. The previous description of the deep learning training process mentioned that the loss from the model is calculated and used to adjust the weight and bias values. How exactly does this work? Suppose one of the samples passed through the training process contained features of an Adelie specimen, class 0. The correct output from the network would be 1, 0, and 0. Now suppose that the output produced by the network is 0.4, 0.3, and 0.3. Comparing these, we can calculate an absolute variance for each element. In other words, how far is each predicted value away from what it should be, as 0.6, 0.3, and 0.3. In reality, since we're actually dealing with multiple observations, we typically aggregate the variance. For example, by squaring the individual variance values and calculating the mean, so we end up with a single average loss value like 0.18. Now, here's the clever bit. The loss is calculated using a function which operates on the results from the final layer of the network, which is also a function. So in effect, the entire model from the input layer right through to the loss calculation is just one big nested function. Functions have a few really useful characteristics. You can conceptualize a function as a plotted line comparing its output with each of its variables. You can use differential calculus to calculate the derivative of the function at any point with respect to its variables. Let's take the first of these capabilities. We can plot the line of the function to show how an individual weight value compares to loss, and mark on that line the point where the current weight value matches the current loss value. Now let's apply the second characteristic of a function. The derivative of a function for a given point indicates whether the slope or gradient of the function output, in this case loss, is increasing or decreasing with respect to a function variable, in this case the weight value. A positive derivative indicates that the function is increasing, and a negative derivative indicates that it is decreasing. In this case, at the plotted point for the current weight value, the function has a downward gradient. In other words, increasing the weight will have the effect of decreasing the loss. We use an optimizer to apply the same trick for all the weight and bias variables in the model and determine in which direction we need to adjust them, up or down, to reduce the overall amount of loss in the model. There are multiple commonly used optimization algorithms, including stochastic gradient descent, adaptive learning rate, adaptive momentum estimation, and others, all of which are designed to figure out how to adjust the weights and biases to minimize loss. Now, the obvious next question is, by how much should the optimizer adjust the weights and bias values? If you look at the plot for our weight value, you can see that increasing the weight by a small amount will follow the function line down, reducing the loss. But if we increase it by too much, the function line starts to go up again, so we might actually increase the loss. And after the next epoch, we might find we need to reduce the weight. The size of the adjustment is controlled by a parameter that you set for training called the learning rate. A low learning rate results in small adjustments, so it can take more epochs to minimize the loss, while a high learning rate results in large adjustments, so you might miss the minimum altogether. In this lesson, you learned about the fundamental principles of deep learning and how to create deep neural network models using PyTorch or TensorFlow. You also explored the use of convolutional neural networks to create image classification models. Deep learning techniques are at the cutting edge of machine learning and artificial intelligence and are used to implement enterprise solutions. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to train a convolutional neural network. While you can use deep learning models for any kind of machine learning, they're particularly useful for dealing with data that consists of large arrays of numeric values, such as images. Machine learning models that work with images are the foundation for an area of artificial intelligence called computer vision. Deep learning techniques have been responsible for driving amazing advances in this area over recent years. At the heart of deep learning success in this area is a kind of model called a convolutional neural network, or CNN. A CNN typically works by extracting features from images and then feeding those features into a fully connected neural network to generate a prediction. The feature extraction layers in the network have the effect of reducing the number of features from the potentially huge array of individual pixel values to a smaller feature set that supports label prediction. Let's take a closer look at CNNs now. CNNs consist of multiple layers, each performing a specific task in extracting features or predicting labels. One of the principal layer types is a convolutional layer that extracts important features in images. A convolutional layer works by applying a filter to images. The filter is defined by a kernel that consists of a matrix of weight values. For example, a 3x3 filter might be defined with value choices of -1, 0, and 1. An image is also just a matrix of pixel values. To apply the filter, you overlay it on an image and calculate a weighted sum of the corresponding image pixel values under the filter kernel. The result is then assigned to the center cell of the equivalent 3x3 patch in a new matrix of values that is the same size as the image. For example, suppose a 6x6 image has pixel values of either 100 or 255 for each grid cell. Applying the filter to the top left 3x3 patch of the image would yield a result of 155. The result is assigned to the corresponding pixel value in the new matrix. Now the filter is moved along or convolved, typically using a step size of 1, so moving along 1 pixel to the right. Then the value for the next pixel is calculated. So now we can fill in the next value of the new matrix. The process repeats until we've applied the filter across all of the 3x3 patches of the image to produce a new matrix of values. Because of the size of the filter kernel, we can't calculate values for the pixels at the edge, so we typically just apply a padding value, which is often 0. The output of the convolution is typically passed to an activation function, which is often a rectified linear unit function that ensures negative values are set to 0. The resulting matrix is a feature map of feature values that can be used to train a machine learning model. It's important to note that the values in the feature map can be greater than the maximum value for a pixel, which is 255. So, if you wanted to visualize the feature map as an image, you would need to normalize the feature values between 0 and 255. Let's take a look at the convolution process now. First, an image is passed to the convolution layer. In this case, the image is a simple geometric shape. Next, the image is composed of an array of pixels with values between 0 and 255. For color images, this is usually a three-dimensional array with values for red, green, and blue channels. Then, a filter kernel is generally initialized with random weights. In this example, we've chosen values to highlight the effect that a filter might have on pixel values. But in a real CNN, the initial weights would typically be generated from a random Gaussian distribution. This filter will be used to extract a feature map from the image data. The filter is convolved across the image, calculating feature values by applying a sum of the weights multiplied by their corresponding pixel values in each position. A rectified linear unit activation function is applied to ensure negative values are set to 0. After convolution, the feature map contains the extracted feature values, which often emphasize key visual attributes of the image. In this case, the feature map highlights the edges and corners of the triangle in the image. Typically, a convolution layer applies multiple filter kernels. Each filter produces a different feature map, and all of the feature maps are passed on to the next layer of the network. After extracting feature values from images, pooling, or downsampling layers are used to reduce the number of feature values while retaining the key differentiating features that have been extracted. One of the most common kinds of pooling is max pooling, in which a filter is applied to the image and only the maximum pixel value within the filter area is retained. So, for example, applying a 2x2 pooling kernel to the following patch of an image would produce the result 155. Note that the effect of the 2x2 pooling filter is to reduce the number of values from 4 to 1. As with convolutional layers, pooling layers work by applying the filter across the whole feature map. The feature map, extracted by a filter in a convolutional layer, contains an array of feature values. A pooling kernel is used to reduce the number of feature values. In this case, the kernel size is 2x2, so it will produce an array with quarter the number of feature values. The pooling kernel is convolved across the feature map, retaining only the highest pixel value in each position. One of the most difficult challenges in a CNN is the avoidance of overfitting, where the resulting model performs well with the training data but doesn't generalize well to new data on which it wasn't trained. One technique you can use to mitigate overfitting is to include layers in which the training process randomly eliminates or drops feature maps. This may seem counterintuitive, but it's an effective way to ensure that the model doesn't learn to be overdependent on the training images. Other techniques you can use to mitigate overfitting include randomly flipping, mirroring, or skewing the training images to generate data that varies between training epochs. After using convolutional and pooling layers to extract the salient features in the images, the resulting feature maps are multidimensional arrays of pixel values. A flattening layer is used to flatten the feature maps into a vector of values that can be used as input to a fully connected layer. Usually, a CNN ends with a fully connected network in which feature values are passed into an input layer through one or more hidden layers and generate predicted values in an output layer. Let's explore basic CNN architecture. First, images are fed into a convolutional layer, In this case, there are two filters, so each image produces two feature maps. The feature maps are passed to a pooling layer, where a 2x2 pooling kernel reduces the size of the feature maps. Then, a dropping layer randomly drops some of the feature maps to help prevent overfitting. A flattening layer takes the remaining feature map arrays and flattens them into a vector. Finally, the vector elements are fed into a fully connected network, which generates the predictions. In this case, the network is a classification model that predicts probabilities for three possible image classes: triangle, square, and circle. As with any deep neural network, a CNN is trained by passing batches of training data through it over multiple epochs, adjusting the weights and bias values based on the loss calculated for each epoch. In the case of a CNN, backpropagation of adjusted weights includes filter kernel weights used in convolutional layers as well as the weights used in fully connected layers. In life, it's often easier to learn a new skill if you already have expertise in a similar transferable skill. For example, it's probably easier to teach someone how to drive a bus if they have already learned how to drive a car. The driver can build on the driving skills they've already learned in a car and apply them to driving a bus. The same principle can be applied to training deep learning models through a technique called transfer learning. A convolutional neural network, or CNN, for image classification is typically composed of multiple layers that extract features and then use a final fully connected layer to classify images based on those features. Conceptually, this neural network consists of two distinct sets of layers: a set of layers from the base model that perform feature extraction, a fully connected layer that takes the extracted features and uses them for a class prediction. The feature extraction layers apply convolutional filters and pooling to emphasize edges, corners, and other patterns in the images that can be used to differentiate them, and in theory should work for any set of images with the same dimensions as the input layer of the network. The prediction layer maps the features to a set of outputs that represent probabilities for each class label you want to use to classify the images. In this lesson, you learned about the fundamental principles of deep learning and how to create deep neural network models using PyTorch or TensorFlow. You also explored the use of convolutional neural networks to create image classification models. Deep learning techniques are at the cutting edge of machine learning and artificial intelligence and are used to implement enterprise solutions. Congratulations on successfully completing this course. Create machine learning models in Microsoft Azure. In the next course, you'll explore Microsoft Azure Machine Learning for data scientists. In this course, you'll explore the following lessons: Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model, create a regression model, create a classification model, create a clustering model. You'll also work through several practical exercises to create your own no-code predictive models with Azure Machine Learning. This course forms part of the preparation for the exam DP100, Designing and Implementing a Data Science Solution on Azure. When you pass the DP100 exam, you earn the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Scientist Associate. Please remember to check out more information about the exam and make sure to read the material that follows for more information on what's to come next.
Hello and welcome. This course aims to help you learn how to use Microsoft Azure Machine Learning to create and publish machine learning models without writing code. Microsoft Azure Machine Learning is a cloud-based service with a wide range of features and capabilities that help data scientists prepare data, train models, publish predictive services, and monitor their usage. In this course, you'll explore the following lessons: Microsoft Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model, create a regression model, create a classification model, and create a clustering model with Azure AI. You'll also work through a number of practical exercises. On completing the exercises, you'll be able to create no-code predictive models with Azure Machine Learning. This hands-on approach will help you in your preparation for the AI 900 exam. To complete the practical exercises, you will make use of an Azure Machine Learning workspace. You can then use this workspace to manage data, compute resources, code, models, and other artifacts related to your machine learning workloads. To use Azure Machine Learning, you create a workspace in your Microsoft Azure subscription. If you don't already have an Azure subscription, you can sign up for a free trial by accessing the Microsoft Azure webpage or using the link provided. You'll also find more detail on how to create an Azure subscription later in this course. After completing each set of practical exercises in a lesson, be sure to follow the cleanup instructions to stop the compute instance until you need it again. You'll have access to the process on how to clean up at the end of each lesson. You'll also have an opportunity to complete knowledge checks that will keep you on track and let you know how you are doing and what you have learned so far, and test prep questions which you can use to check your progress and prepare effectively for the AI 900 exam. Once you successfully complete this course, you'll be awarded a Coursera certificate. Good luck with your preparation. Welcome. In this lesson, we will look at how to train and deploy a predictive model in Microsoft Azure Machine Learning. After completing this lesson, you will be able to identify different types of machine learning models and use the automated machine learning capability of Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model. What is machine learning? Machine learning is a technique that uses mathematics and statistics to create a model that can predict unknown values. It is the foundation for most artificial intelligence solutions. The creation of an artificially intelligent solution often begins with the use of machine learning to train a predictive model using historic data that you have collected. Training and deploying an effective machine learning model involves a lot of work. It can be a time-consuming and resource-intensive process. Azure Machine Learning is a cloud-based service with a wide range of features and capabilities that help data scientists to prepare data, train models, publish predictive services, and monitor their usage. Most importantly, it helps data scientists increase their efficiency by automating many of the time-consuming tasks associated with training models. Azure Machine Learning also enables the use of cloud-based compute resources that scale effectively to handle large volumes of data. With this cloud-based service, you pay only for the Azure Machine Learning resources that you use. To create an artificially intelligent solution, you often begin by using machine learning to train a predictive model using historic data. For example, suppose Adventure Work Cycles is a business that rents bicycles. To ensure that sufficient staff and bicycles are always available, the business could use historic data to train a model that predicts daily rental demand. To do this, the business could create a machine learning model that takes information about a specific day, the day of the week, the anticipated weather conditions, and so on, as an input. The model then predicts the expected number of rentals as an output. Later, you will see more about how Adventure Work Cycles could use a machine learning model. In the rest of this lesson, you'll explore Azure Machine Learning and in particular, its automated machine learning capability. Be sure to check out the next video which discusses the various types of machine learning model you can create and the process generally followed to train and use them. Congratulations! You've completed this lesson on Microsoft Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model. In this lesson, you explored machine learning, identified different types of machine learning model, and learned how to use the automated machine learning capabilities of Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model. Don't forget to do your end of lesson cleanup. The web service you created during the practical sessions is hosted in an Azure container instance. If you don't intend to experiment with it further, you should delete the endpoint to avoid accruing unnecessary Azure usage. You should also stop the training cluster and the compute instance resources until you need them again. You will find step-by-step cleanup instructions elsewhere in this lesson. Hello and welcome. In this lesson, you'll learn how to train and publish a regression model with Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer without needing to write any code. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to use Azure Machine Learning Designer to train a regression model, use a regression model for inferencing, and deploy a regression model as a service. Earlier in this course, you explored machine learning. Machine learning uses algorithms to identify patterns within data, and those patterns are then used to create a data model that can make predictions. Regression is a form of machine learning that is used to predict a numeric label based on an item's features. For example, an automobile sales company might use the characteristics of an auto, such as engine size, number of seats, mileage, and so on, to predict its likely selling price. In this case, the characteristics of the car are the features, and the selling price is the label. Regression is an example of a supervised machine learning technique in which you train a model using data. The data includes both the features and known values for the label, so that the model learns to fit the feature combinations to the label. Then after training has been completed, you can use the trained model to predict labels for new items for which the label is unknown. You can use Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer to create regression models by using a drag-and-drop visual interface without needing to write any code. Congratulations, you've completed this lesson. Let's look at some of the key elements you explored in this lesson. First, you learned how to use Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer to train a regression model by creating a pipeline. After creating and running a pipeline to train the model, you use the trained model to inference, in other words predict, label values based on its features. Lastly, you practice deploying and testing a predictive service. Once you've completed all the practical exercises in this lesson, please remember to clean up. If you don't intend to experiment any further, you should delete the endpoint to avoid accruing unnecessary Azure usage. And you should also stop the compute instance until you need it again. You can access the detailed process in the reading on cleanup. Welcome to this lesson where you will create a classification model with Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to use Azure Machine Learning Designer to train a classification model, use a classification model for inferencing, and deploy a classification model as a service. What is classification? Classification is a form of machine learning that is used to predict which category or class an item belongs to. For example, a health clinic might use the characteristics of a patient, such as age, weight, blood pressure, and so on, to predict whether the patient is at risk of diabetes. In this case, the characteristics of the patient are the features, and the label is a classification of either 0 or 1, representing non-diabetic or diabetic. Classification is an example of a supervised machine learning technique in which you train a model using data that includes both the features and known values for the label. With classification, the model learns to fit the feature combinations to the label. In our health clinic example, measurements such as weight, height, glucose level, blood pressure, and so on are collected for each patient. These are the features, represented by X in our equation. We also know if the patient we are measuring is diabetic or not. That label, Y, is a classification of the patient. In this case, the class is whether the patient is diabetic or not diabetic. When training is completed, you can use the trained model to predict labels for new items for which the label is unknown. When measurements of a new patient are taken, the trained model uses those features to predict the probability of the patient being diabetic or not diabetic. You can use Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer to create classification models by using a drag and drop visual interface without needing to write any code. To complete this module, you'll need to use your Microsoft Azure subscription. Congratulations, you've completed this lesson. In this lesson, you trained and published a classification model with Azure Machine Learning Designer. Don't forget to do your end of lesson cleanup. The web service you created during the practical sessions is hosted in an Azure container instance. If you don't intend to experiment with it further, you should delete the endpoint to avoid accruing unnecessary Azure usage. You should also stop the training cluster and the compute instance resources until you need them again. Full cleanup instructions are shown earlier. Hello and welcome. In this lesson, you'll learn how to train and publish a clustering model with Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Designer without needing to write any code. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to use Azure Machine Learning Designer to train a clustering model, use a clustering model for inferencing, and deploy a clustering model as a service. Clustering is a form of machine learning that is used to group similar items into clusters based on their features. For example, a researcher might take measurements of penguins and group them based on similarities in their proportions. In Microsoft Azure Machine Learning, data for model training and other operations is usually encapsulated in an object called a dataset. In this lesson, you'll use a dataset that includes observations of 3 species of penguin. Earlier in this course, you explored regression, which is an example of a supervised machine learning technique. Using this technique, you trained a model using data that includes both the features and known values for the label. In this lesson, you'll focus on unsupervised machine learning. Clustering is an example of unsupervised machine learning, in which you train a model to separate items into clusters based purely on their characteristics or features. There is no previously known cluster value or label from which to train the model. You can use Azure Machine Learning Designer to create clustering models by using a drag and drop visual interface without needing to write any code. Congratulations! You've completed the final lesson in this course. Please remember to clean up. If you don't intend to experiment any further, you should delete the endpoint to avoid accruing unnecessary Azure usage. And you should also stop the compute instance until you need it again. You can access the process in the reading on cleanup. In this course, you explored some fundamental machine learning concepts and used the automated machine learning capabilities of Microsoft Azure Machine Learning to train and deploy a predictive model. You also gained hands-on experience on how to use Azure Machine Learning Designer and Azure Machine Learning Studio to train, use, and deploy a regression, classification, and clustering model. You are one step further down the road to certification. Microsoft Azure certifications validate the skills and knowledge that you demonstrate. Successfully completing this program can help you to develop your career goals as well as open up further career opportunities.
Congratulations on successfully completing this course, Microsoft Azure Machine Learning for Data Scientists. In the next course, you'll learn how to build and operate machine learning solutions with Azure Machine Learning. In this course, you'll explore the following lessons. Use the Azure Machine Learning SDK to train a model, work with data and compute in Azure Machine Learning, orchestrate pipelines and deploy real-time machine learning services with Azure Machine Learning, deploy batch inference pipelines and tune hyperparameters with Azure Machine Learning, select models and protect sensitive data, and monitor machine learning deployments. You'll also work through several practical exercises to create models and pipelines. This course forms part of the preparation for the exam DP100, Designing and Implementing a Data Science Solution on Azure. When you pass the DP100 exam, you earn the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Scientist Associate. Please remember to check out more information about the exam and make sure to read the material that follows for more information on what's to come next.
Hello and welcome to this course, Build and Operate Machine Learning Solutions with Azure Machine Learning. In this course, you will learn how to use the Azure Machine Learning Python SDK to create and manage enterprise-ready ML solutions. This course is comprised of the following modules. Use the Azure Machine Learning SDK to train a model. Work with data and compute in Azure Machine Learning. Orchestrate pipelines and deploy real-time machine learning services with Azure Machine Learning. Deploy batch inference pipelines and tune hyperparameters with Azure Machine Learning. Select models and protect sensitive data and monitor machine learning deployments. Let's start with the first module. Use the Azure Machine Learning SDK to train a model. In this module, you will provision an Azure Machine Learning workspace, use tools and interfaces to work with Azure Machine Learning, run code-based experiments in an Azure Machine Learning workspace, use a script run config to run a model training script as an Azure Machine Learning experiment, create reusable parameterized training scripts, and register trained models. In the next module, you will explore how to train and evaluate classification and clustering models. Data is the foundation of machine learning. In this module, you will learn how to work with data stores and data sets in Azure Machine Learning, enabling you to build scalable cloud-based model training solutions. You'll also learn how to use cloud compute in Azure Machine Learning to run training experiments at scale. Next, you will learn how to orchestrate pipelines and deploy real-time machine learning services with Azure Machine Learning. In this module, you'll learn how to create, publish, and run pipelines to train models in Azure Machine Learning. You'll also learn how to register and deploy ML models with the Azure Machine Learning Service. Next, you will learn how to deploy batch inference pipelines and tune hyperparameters with Azure Machine Learning. Machine learning models are often used to generate predictions from large numbers of observations in a batch process. In this module, you will accomplish this using Azure Machine Learning to publish a batch inference pipeline. You will also leverage cloud-scale experiments to choose optimal hyperparameter values for model training. Up next, you will learn how to select models and protect sensitive data. In this module, you will learn how to use automated machine learning in Azure Machine Learning to find the best model for your data. You will learn how differential privacy is a leading-edge approach that enables useful analysis while protecting individually identifiable data values. You will also learn about the factors that influence the predictions models make. Finally, you will learn how to monitor machine learning deployments. Machine learning models can often encapsulate unintentional bias that results in unfairness. In this module, you will learn how to use FairLearn and Azure Machine Learning to detect and mitigate unfairness in your models. You will learn how to use telemetry to understand how a machine learning model is being used once it has been deployed into production. Finally, you will learn how to monitor data drift to ensure your model continues to predict accurately. Additionally, throughout this course, you will have an opportunity to explore machine learning models in Microsoft Azure through interactive exercises and real-world examples of data science in action, knowledge checks, and practice exams. We wish you every success as you start this learning journey. Hello and welcome to this lesson, where you will learn about the Azure Machine Learning Software Development Kit. Azure Machine Learning is a platform for operating machine learning workloads in the cloud. Built on the Microsoft Azure Cloud Platform, Azure Machine Learning enables you to manage scalable on-demand compute for machine learning workloads, data storage and connectivity to ingest data from a wide range of sources, machine learning workflow orchestration to automate model training, deployment and management processes, model registration and management so you can track multiple versions of models and the data on which they were trained, metrics and monitoring for training experiments, datasets and published services, and model deployment for real-time and batch inferencing. In this lesson, you will learn how to provision an Azure Machine Learning workspace, use tools and interfaces to work with Azure Machine Learning, and run code-based experiments in an Azure Machine Learning workspace. Azure Machine Learning provides a cloud-based service that offers flexibility in how you use it. There are user interfaces specifically designed for Azure Machine Learning, or you can use a programmatic interface to manage workspace resources and run machine learning operations. You can manage the assets in your Azure Machine Learning workspace in the Azure portal. However, as this is a general interface for managing all kinds of resources in Azure, data scientists and other users involved in machine learning operations may prefer to use a more focused, dedicated interface. Azure Machine Learning Studio is a web-based tool for managing an Azure Machine Learning workspace. It enables you to create, manage, and view all of the assets in your workspace and provides the following graphical tools. Designer. This is a drag-and-drop interface for no-code machine learning model development. Automated machine learning. This is a wizard interface that enables you to train a model using a combination of algorithms and data pre-processing techniques to find the best model for your data. It's important to note that a previously released tool named Azure Machine Learning Studio provided a free service for drag-and-drop machine learning model development. The Studio interface for the Azure Machine Learning service includes this capability in the Designer tool, as well as other workspace asset management capabilities. To use Azure Machine Learning Studio, use a web browser to navigate to ml.azure.com and sign in using credentials associated with your Azure subscription. You can then select the subscription and workspace you want to manage. While graphical interfaces like Azure Machine Learning Studio make it easy to create and manage machine learning assets, it is often advantageous to use a code-based approach to managing resources. By writing scripts to create and manage resources, you can run machine learning operations from your preferred development environment, automate asset creation and configuration to make it repeatable, ensure consistency for resources that must be replicated in multiple environments, for example, development, test, and production. Incorporate machine learning asset configuration into developer operations or DevOps workflows, such as continuous integration, continuous deployment, or CI/CD pipelines. Azure Machine Learning provides software development kits or SDKs for Python and R, which you can use to create, manage, and use assets in an Azure Machine Learning workspace. Note that this course focuses on the Python SDK because it has broader capabilities than the R SDK. Okay, let's now learn how to install the Azure Machine Learning SDK for Python. You can install the Azure Machine Learning SDK for Python by using the pip package management utility and using the pip install command. The SDK is installed using the Python pip utility and consists of the main Azure ML SDK package, as well as numerous other ancillary packages that contain specialized functionality. For example, the Azure ML Widgets package provides support for interactive widgets in a Jupyter Notebook environment. To install additional packages, include them in the pip install command. For more information about installing the Azure Machine Learning SDK for Python, see the SDK documentation from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Also, you should be aware that the SDK is updated on a regular basis and review the release notes for the latest release. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. After installing the SDK package in your Python environment, you can write code to connect to your workspace and perform machine learning operations. The easiest way to connect to a workspace is to use a workspace configuration file, which includes the Azure subscription, resource group, and workspace details. You can download a configuration file for a workspace from the overview page of its blade in the Azure portal or from Azure Machine Learning Studio. To connect to the workspace using the configuration file, you can use the from_config method of the workspace class in the SDK. By default, the from_config method looks for a file named config.json in the folder containing the Python code file, but you can specify another path if necessary. As an alternative to using a configuration file, you can use the get method of the workspace class, which explicitly specifies subscription, resource group, and workspace details. However, the configuration file technique is generally preferred due to its greater flexibility when using multiple scripts. Whichever technique you use, if there is no current active session with your Azure subscription, you will be prompted to authenticate. The workspace class is the starting point for most code operations. For example, you can use its compute targets attribute to retrieve a dictionary object containing the compute targets defined in the workspace. The SDK contains a rich library of classes that you can use to create, manage, and use many kinds of asset in Azure Machine Learning Workspace. For more information about the Compute Targets Azure Machine Learning SDK, see the SDK documentation from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. The Azure Command Line Interface, or CLI, is a cross-platform command line tool for managing Azure resources. The Azure Machine Learning CLI extension is an additional package that provides commands for working with Azure Machine Learning. To install the Azure Machine Learning CLI extension, you must first install the Azure CLI. See the full installation instructions for all supported platforms for more details. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. After installing the Azure CLI, you can add the Azure Machine Learning CLI extension by running an AZ extension command. To use the Azure Machine Learning CLI extension, run the azml command with the appropriate parameters for the action you want to perform. It is important to note the following. In the code sample above, the -g parameter specifies the name of the resource group in which the Azure Machine Learning workspace specified in the -w parameter is defined. These parameters are shortened aliases for -- resource group and -- workspace name. For more information about the Azure Machine Learning CLI extension, see the documentation. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Azure Machine Learning includes the ability to create compute instances in a workspace to provide a development environment that is managed with all of the other assets in the workspace. Compute instances include Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter Lab installations that you can use to write and run code that uses the Azure Machine Learning SDK to work with assets in your workspace. You can choose a compute instance image that provides the compute specification you need, from small CPU-only VMs to large GPU-enabled workstations. Because compute instances are hosted in Azure, you only pay for the compute resources when they are running, so you can create a compute instance to suit your needs. Stop it when your workload has completed to minimize costs, and you can store notebooks independently in workspace storage and open them in any compute instance. Visual Studio Code is a lightweight code editing environment for Microsoft Windows, Apple macOS, and Linux. It provides a visual interface for many kinds of code, including Microsoft C#, JavaScript, Python, and others. It also provides IntelliSense and syntax formatting for common data formats such as JSON and XML. Visual Studio Code's flexibility is based on the ability to install modular extensions that add syntax checking, debugging, and visual management interfaces for specific workloads. For example, the Microsoft Python extension for Visual Studio Code adds support for writing and running Python code in scripts or notebooks within the Visual Studio Code interface. The Azure Machine Learning extension for Visual Studio Code provides a graphical interface for working with assets in an Azure Machine Learning workspace. You can combine the capabilities of the Azure Machine Learning and Python extensions to manage a complete end-to-end machine learning workload in Azure Machine Learning from the Visual Studio Code environment. For more information about using the Azure Machine Learning extension for Visual Studio Code, see the documentation. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Like any scientific discipline, data science involves running experiments, typically to explore data or to build and evaluate predictive models. In Azure Machine Learning, an experiment is a named process, usually the running of a script or a pipeline, that can generate metrics and outputs and be tracked in the Azure Machine Learning workspace. This experiment can be run multiple times with different data, code, or settings, and Azure Machine Learning tracks each run, enabling you to view run history and compare results for each run. Now let's have a look at how experiments are controlled in Azure Machine Learning. When you submit an experiment, you use its run context to initialize and end the experiment run that is tracked in Azure Machine Learning. After the experiment run is completed, you can view the details of the run in the Experiments tab in Azure Machine Learning Studio. Experiments are most useful when they produce metrics and outputs that can be tracked across runs. Every experiment generates log files that include the messages that will be written to the terminal during interactive execution. This enables you to use simple print statements to write messages to the log. However, if you want to record named metrics for comparison across runs, you can do so by using the run object, which provides a range of logging functions specifically for this purpose. These include log, record a single named value; log list, record a named list of values; log row, record a row with multiple columns; log table, record a dictionary as a table; and log image, record an image file or a plot. For more information about logging metrics during experiment runs, see Monitor Azure ML experiment runs and metrics on the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. For example, you can use a code that records the number of observations, records, in a CSV file. You can view the metrics logged by an experiment run in Azure Machine Learning Studio. Or by using the Run Details widget in a notebook, you can also retrieve the metrics using the Run Object's getMetrics method. This method returns a JSON representation of the metrics. This might then produce output observations. In addition to logging metrics, an experiment can generate output files. Often, these are trained machine learning models, but you can save any sort of file and make it available as an output of your experiment run. The output files of an experiment are saved in its Outputs folder. The technique you use to add files to the outputs of an experiment depend on how you're running the experiment. The examples mentioned here so far control the experiment lifecycle inline in your code. When taking this approach, you can upload local files to the Run's Outputs folder by using the Run Object's upload file method in your experiment code. When running an experiment in a remote compute context, which we'll discuss later in this course, any files written to the Outputs folder in the compute context are automatically uploaded to the Run's Outputs folder when the run completes. Whichever approach you use to run your experiments, you can retrieve a list of output files from the Run object, which would produce an output showing output/sample.csv. You can run an experiment inline using the start logging method of the experiment object, but it's more common to encapsulate the experiment logic in a script and run the script as an experiment. The script can be run in any valid compute context, making this a more flexible solution for running experiments at scale. An experiment script is just a Python code file that contains the code you want to run in the experiment. To access the experiment run context, which is needed to log metrics, the script must import the azureml.core.run class and call its getContext method. The script can then use the run context to log metrics, upload files, and complete the experiment. To run a script as an experiment, you must define a script configuration that defines the script to be run and the Python environment in which to run it. This is implemented by using a script run config object. For example, the code could be used to run an experiment based on a script in the experiment files folder, which must also contain any files used by the script, such as the data.csv file in the previous script code example. It's important to note an implicitly created run configuration object defines the Python environment for the experiment, including the packages available to the script. Also, if your script depends on packages that are not included in the default environment, you must associate the script run config with an environment object that makes use of a conda dependencies object to specify the Python packages required. Runtime environments are discussed in more detail later in this course. In this lesson, you learned how to use Python to explore, visualize, and manipulate data, or more specifically, provision an Azure Machine Learning workspace, use tools and interfaces to work with Azure Machine Learning, and run code-based experiments in an Azure Machine Learning workspace. Training a machine learning model can be as easy as loading data and running one line of code using packages like scikit-learn. However, in a production machine learning scenario, you need to consider creating reusable training scripts for multiple compute environments, logging model performance metrics during training and evaluation processes, and tracking model versions. In this lesson, you will learn how to use a script run config to run a model training script as an Azure Machine Learning experiment, create reusable parameterized training scripts, and register trained models. In this lesson, you learned how to train a machine learning model with Azure Machine Learning, or more specifically, you learned how to use script run config to run a model training script as an Azure Machine Learning experiment, create reusable parameterized training scripts, and register trained models. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to work with data in Azure Machine Learning. Data is a fundamental element in any machine learning workload. In this lesson, you will learn how to create and manage data stores and data sets in an Azure Machine Learning workspace and how to use them in model training experiments. In this lesson, you will learn how to create and use data stores and create and use data sets. In Azure Machine Learning, data stores are abstractions for cloud data sources. They encapsulate the information required to connect to data sources. You can access data stores directly in code by using the Azure Machine Learning SDK and use it to upload or download data. Azure Machine Learning supports the creation of data stores for multiple kinds of Azure data source, including Azure Storage, blob and file containers, Azure Data Lake Stores, Azure SQL Database, and Azure Databricks File System or DBFS. For a full list of supported data stores, see the Azure Machine Learning documentation from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this web page from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Every workspace has two built-in data stores, an Azure Storage Blob container and an Azure Storage File container that are used as system storage by Azure Machine Learning. There's also a third data store that gets added to your workspace if you make use of the open data sets provided as samples, for example, by creating a designer pipeline based on a sample data set. In most machine learning projects, you will likely need to work with data sources of your own. This is because you will either need to store larger volumes of data than the built-in data store support, or because you need to integrate your machine learning solution with data from existing applications. To add a data store to your workspace, you can register it using the graphical interface in Azure Machine Learning Studio, or you can use the Azure Machine Learning SDK. For example, registering an Azure Storage Blob container as a data store named blob_data. You can view and manage data stores in Azure Machine Learning Studio, or you can use the Azure Machine Learning SDK. For example, using a for loop to list the names of each data store in the workspace. You can then get a reference to any data store by using the data store get method. The workspace always includes a default data store, which you can retrieve by using the get default data store method of a workspace object. The default data store is initially built-in workspace blob store data store. When planning for data stores, consider the following guidelines. When using Azure Blob Storage, premium level storage may provide improved I/O performance for large data sets. However, this option will increase cost and may limit replication options for data redundancy. When working with data files, although CSV format is very common, Parquet format generally results in better performance. You can access any data store by name, but you may want to consider changing the default data store, which is initially the built-in workspace blob store data store. To change the default data store, use the set default data store method. In this lesson, you learned how to work with data in Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to create and use data stores and create and use data sets. For more details about working with data in Azure Machine Learning, see the Data Access in Azure Machine Learning webpage, which is available from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this webpage from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to work with compute in Azure Machine Learning. In Azure Machine Learning, data scientists can run experiments based on scripts that process data, train machine learning models, and perform other data science tasks. The runtime context for each experiment run consists of two elements: the environment for the script, which includes all packages on which the script depends, and the compute target on which the environment will be deployed and the script run. In this lesson, you will learn how to create and use environments and create and use compute targets. Python code runs in the context of a virtual environment that defines the version of the Python runtime to be used as well as the installed packages available to the code. In most Python installations, packages are installed and managed in environments using conda or pip. To improve portability, we usually create environments in Docker containers that are in turn hosted in compute targets, such as your development computer, virtual machines, or clusters in the cloud. In general, Azure Machine Learning handles environment creation and package installation for you, usually through the creation of Docker containers. You can specify the conda or pip packages you need and have Azure Machine Learning create an environment for the experiment. In an enterprise machine learning solution where experiments may be run in a variety of compute contexts, it can be important to be aware of the environments in which your experiment code is running. Environments are encapsulated by the environment class, which you can use to create environments and specify runtime configuration for an experiment. You can have Azure Machine Learning manage environment creation and package installation to define an environment and then register it for reuse. Alternatively, you can manage your own environments and register them. This makes it possible to define consistent, reusable runtime context for your experiments, regardless of where the experiment script is run. Welcome to this section where you will learn about compute targets. In Azure Machine Learning, compute targets are physical or virtual computers on which experiments are run. Azure Machine Learning supports multiple types of compute for experimentation and training. This enables you to select the most appropriate type of compute target for your particular needs. These types include local compute, compute clusters, and attached compute. Let's look at each of these in a little more detail now. You can specify a local compute target for most processing tasks in Azure Machine Learning. This runs the experiment on the same compute target as the code used to initiate the experiment. This may be your physical workstation or a virtual machine such as an Azure Machine Learning compute instance on which you are running a notebook. Local compute is generally a great choice during development and testing with low to moderate volumes of data. For experiment workloads with high scalability requirements, you can use Azure Machine Learning compute clusters, which are multi-node clusters of virtual machines that automatically scale up or down to meet demand. This is a cost-effective way to run experiments that need to handle large volumes of data or use parallel processing to distribute the workload and reduce the time it takes to run. If you already use an Azure-based compute environment for data science, such as a virtual machine or an Azure Databricks cluster, you can attach it to your Azure Machine Learning workspace and use it as a compute target for certain types of workload. It's important to note that in Azure Machine Learning Studio, you can create another type of compute named inference clusters. This kind of compute represents an Azure Kubernetes service cluster and can only be used to deploy trained models as inferencing services. We'll explore deployment later, but for now we'll focus on compute for experiments and model training. The ability to assign experiment runs to specific compute targets helps you implement a flexible data science ecosystem in the following ways. Code can be developed and tested on local or low-cost compute and then moved to more scalable compute for production workloads. You can run individual processes on the compute target that best fits its needs. For example, by using GPU-based compute to train deep learning models and switching to lower-cost CPU-only compute to test and register the trained model. One of the core benefits of cloud computing is the ability to manage costs by paying only for what you use. In Azure Machine Learning, you can take advantage of this principle by defining compute targets that start on demand and stop automatically when no longer required, and scale automatically based on workload processing needs. In this lesson, you learned how to work with compute in Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to create and use environments and create and use compute targets. For more information about environments in Azure Machine Learning, see Reuse Environments for Training and Deployment by using Azure Machine Learning. And for more information about compute targets in Azure Machine Learning, see What are compute targets in Azure Machine Learning. You can find a link to these resources from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hello. In Azure Machine Learning, you run workloads as experiments that leverage data assets and compute resources. In an enterprise data science process, you'll generally want to separate the overall process into individual tasks and orchestrate these tasks as pipelines of connected steps. Pipelines are key to implementing an effective machine learning operationalization, or MLOps solution in Azure, so you'll explore how to define and run them in this module. It is important to note that the term pipeline is used extensively in machine learning, often with different meanings. For example, in scikit-learn, you can define pipelines that combine data pre-processing transformations with a training algorithm. And in Azure DevOps, you can define a build or release pipeline to perform the build and configuration tasks required to deliver software. The focus of this module is on Azure Machine Learning pipelines, which encapsulates steps that can be run as an experiment. However, it is important to bear in mind that it's perfectly feasible to have an Azure DevOps pipeline with a task that initiates an Azure Machine Learning pipeline, which in turn includes a step that trains a model that is based on a scikit-learn pipeline. In this lesson, you will learn how to create an Azure Machine Learning pipeline, publish an Azure Machine Learning pipeline, and schedule an Azure Machine Learning pipeline. In Azure Machine Learning, a pipeline is a type of workflow. It is a workflow of machine learning tasks in which each task is implemented as a step. These steps can be arranged sequentially or in parallel, enabling you to build sophisticated flow logic to orchestrate machine learning operations. Each step can be run on a specific compute target, making it possible to combine different types of processing as required to achieve an overall goal. A pipeline can be executed as a process by running the pipeline as an experiment. Then each step in the pipeline runs on its allocated compute target as part of the overall experiment run. An Azure Machine Learning pipeline consists of one or more steps that perform tasks. There are many kinds of steps supported by Azure Machine Learning pipelines, each with its own specialized purpose and configuration options. Common kinds of steps in an Azure Machine Learning pipeline include Python script step, runs a specified Python script. Data transfer step, uses Azure Data Factory to copy data between data stores. Databricks step, runs a notebook, script or compiled jar on a Databricks cluster. Atlas step, runs a uSQL job in Azure Data Lake Analytics. And parallel run step, runs a Python script as a distributed task on multiple compute nodes. It's important to note that for a full list of supported step types, see azure.pipeline.steps package documentation. You can find a link to this document from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. To create a pipeline, you must first define each step and then create a pipeline that includes the steps. The specific configuration of each step depends on the step type. For example, you can use a code that defines 2 Python script steps to prepare data and then train a model. After these steps are defined, you can assign them to a pipeline and run it as an experiment. Often a pipeline includes at least one step that depends on the output of a preceding step. For example, you might use a step that runs a Python script to pre-process some data, which must then be used in a subsequent step to train a model. The output file dataset config object is a special kind of dataset. It is the kind of dataset that references a location in a data store for interim storage of data and creates a data dependency between pipeline steps. You can view an output file dataset config object as an intermediary store for data that must be passed from a step to a subsequent step. As advised, you can use the output file dataset config to pass data between steps. In order to do this, you must define a named output file dataset config object that references a location in a data store. If no explicit data store is specified, the default data store is used. Pass the output file dataset config object as a script argument in steps that run scripts, and include code in those scripts to write to the output file dataset config argument as an output or read it as an input. For example, you can use code that defines an output file dataset config object for the pre-processed data. In the scripts themselves, you can obtain a reference to the output file dataset config object from the script argument and use it like a local folder. You can access the full version of this code from the reading at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to create an Azure Machine Learning pipeline, publish an Azure Machine Learning pipeline, and schedule an Azure Machine Learning pipeline. In machine learning, inferencing refers to the use of a trained model to predict labels for new data on which the model has not been trained. Often the model is deployed as part of a service that enables applications to request immediate or real-time predictions for individual or small numbers of data observations. In Azure Machine Learning, you can create real-time inferencing solutions by deploying a model as a service hosted in a containerized platform such as Azure Kubernetes Services, or AKS. In this lesson, you will learn how to deploy a model as a real-time inferencing service, consume a real-time inferencing service, and troubleshoot service deployment. There are a lot of elements to a real-time service deployment. These can include the trained model, the runtime environment configuration, the scoring script, the container image, and the container host. Troubleshooting a failed deployment or an error when consuming a deployed service can be complex. As an initial troubleshooting step, you can check the status of a service by examining its state through the Get the Deployed Service method. It's important to note that to view the state of a service, you must use the compute-specific service type, for example, AKS Web Service, and not a generic web service object. For an operational service, the state should be healthy. If a service is not healthy, or you are experiencing errors when using it, you can review its logs. You can review these logs using a code. The logs include detailed information about the provisioning of the service and the requests it has processed. These can often provide an insight into the cause of unexpected errors. Deployment and runtime errors can be easier to diagnose. You can do this by deploying the service as a container in a local Docker instance. You can then test the locally deployed service using the SDK. You can then troubleshoot runtime issues by making changes to the scoring file that is referenced in the inference configuration, then reloading the service without redeploying it, something you can only do with a local service. In this lesson, you learned how to deploy real-time machine learning services with Azure Machine Learning, or more specifically, deploy a model as a real-time inferencing service, consume a real-time inferencing service, and troubleshoot service deployment. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to deploy batch inference pipelines with Azure Machine Learning. In many production scenarios, long-running tasks that operate on large volumes of data are performed as batch operations. In machine learning, batch inferencing is used to apply a predictive model to multiple cases asynchronously, usually writing the results to a file or database. In Azure Machine Learning, you can implement batch inferencing solutions by creating a pipeline that includes a step to read the input data, load a registered model, predict labels, and write the results as its output. In this lesson, you will publish a batch inference pipeline for a trained model and use a batch inference pipeline to generate predictions. In this lesson, you have learned to deploy batch inference pipelines with Azure Machine Learning, or more specifically, publish a batch inference pipeline for a trained model and use a batch inference pipeline to generate predictions. Hello. In machine learning, models are trained to predict unknown labels for new data based on correlations between known labels and features found in the training data. Depending on the algorithm used, you may need to specify hyperparameters to configure how the model is trained. For example, the logistic regression algorithm uses a regularization rate hyperparameter to counteract overfitting. Deep learning techniques for convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, use hyperparameters like learning rate to control how weights are adjusted during training and batch size to determine how many data items are included in each training batch. It is important to note that machine learning is an academic field with its own particular terminology. Data scientists refer to the values determined from the training features as parameters, so a different term is required for values that are used to configure training behavior, but which are not derived from the training data, hence the term hyperparameter. The choice of hyperparameter values can significantly affect the resulting model, making it important to select the best possible values for your particular data and predictive performance goals. Hyperparameter tuning is accomplished by training the multiple models using the same algorithm and training data, but different hyperparameter values. The resulting model from each training run is then evaluated to determine the performance metric for which you want to optimize, for example, accuracy, and the best performing model is selected. In Azure Machine Learning, you achieve this through an experiment that consists of a hyperdrive run which initiates a child run for each hyperparameter combination to be tested. Each of these child runs uses a training script with parameterized hyperparameter values to train a model and logs the target performance metric achieved by the trained model. In this lesson, you will learn how to tune hyperparameters with Azure Machine Learning, or more specifically, define a hyperparameter search space, configure hyperparameter sampling, select an early termination policy, and run a hyperparameter tuning experiment. The set of hyperparameter values tried during hyperparameter tuning is known as the search space. The definition of the range of possible values that can be chosen depends on the type of hyperparameter. Some hyperparameters require discrete values. In other words, you must select the value from a particular set of possibilities. You can define a search space for a discrete parameter using a choice from a list of explicit values, which you can define as a Python list, a range, or an arbitrary set of comma-separated values. You can also select discrete values from any of the following discrete distributions: Q-normal, Q-uniform, Q-log-normal, and Q-log-uniform. Some hyperparameters are continuous. In other words, you can use any value along a scale. To define a search space for these kinds of value, you can use any of the following distribution types: normal, uniform, log-normal, and log-uniform. To define a search space for hyperparameter tuning, create a dictionary with the appropriate parameter expression for each named hyperparameter. For example, in the search space, it can indicate that the batch size hyperparameter can have the value 16, 32, or 64, and the learning rate hyperparameter can have any value from a normal distribution with a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. With a sufficiently large hyperparameter search space, it could take many iterations or child runs to try every possible combination. Typically, you set a maximum number of iterations, but this could still result in a large number of runs that don't result in a better model than a combination that has already been tried. To help prevent wasting time, you can set an early termination policy that abandons runs. The runs that are abandoned are unlikely to produce a better result than the previously completed runs. This policy is evaluated at an evaluation interval you specify, based on each time the target performance metric is logged. You can also set a delay evaluation parameter in order to avoid evaluating the policy until the minimum number of iterations have been completed. It is important to note early termination is particularly useful for deep learning scenarios where a deep neural network, or DNN, is trained iteratively over a number of epochs. The training script can report the target metric after each epoch, and if the run is significantly underperforming previous runs after the same number of intervals, it can be abandoned. You can use a bandit policy to stop a run if the target performance metric underperforms the best run so far by a specified margin. This example applies the policy for every iteration after the first 5 and abandons runs where the reported target metric is 0.2 or more worse than the best performing run after the same number of intervals. You can also apply a bandit policy using a slack factor, which compares the performance metric as a ratio rather than an absolute value. A median stopping policy abandons runs where the target performance metric is worse than the median of the running averages for all runs. A truncation selection policy cancels the lowest performing X% of runs at each evaluation interval based on the truncation percentage value you specify for X. In this lesson, you've learned how to tune hyperparameters with Azure Machine Learning, or more specifically, define a hyperparameter search space, configure hyperparameter sampling, select an early termination policy, and run a hyperparameter tuning experiment. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to automate machine learning model selection with Azure Machine Learning. Automated machine learning enables you to try multiple algorithms and pre-processing transformations with your data. This, combined with scalable cloud-based compute, makes it possible to find the best performing model for your data without the huge amount of time-consuming manual trial and error that would otherwise be required. Azure Machine Learning includes support for automated machine learning through a visual interface in Azure Machine Learning Studio. You can use the Azure Machine Learning SDK to run automated machine learning experiments. In this lesson, you will learn how to use Azure Machine Learning's automated machine learning capabilities to determine the best performing algorithm for your data, use automated machine learning to pre-process data for training, and run an automated machine learning experiment. You can use automated machine learning in Azure Machine Learning to train models for the following types of machine learning tasks: classification, regression, and time series forecasting. Azure Machine Learning includes support for numerous commonly used algorithms for these tasks. These include classification algorithms such as logistic regression and decision tree, regression algorithms such as linear regression, random forest, and elastic net, and finally, forecasting algorithms such as linear regression and decision tree. For a full list of supported algorithms, see How to Define a Machine Learning Task from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. By default, automated machine learning will randomly select from the full range of algorithms for the specified task. You can choose to block individual algorithms from being selected, which can be useful if you know that your data is not suited to a particular type of algorithm. Or you have to comply with a policy that restricts the type of machine learning algorithms you can use in your organization. Hello. In this section, you will explore pre-processing and featurization. As well as trying a selection of algorithms, automated machine learning can apply pre-processing transformations to your data, improving the performance of the model. Automated machine learning applies scaling and normalization to numeric data automatically, helping prevent any large-scale features from dominating training. During an automated machine learning experiment, multiple scaling or normalization techniques will be applied. You can choose to have automated machine learning apply pre-processing transformations, such as missing value imputation to eliminate nulls in the training dataset, categorical encoding to convert categorical features to numeric indicators, dropping high cardinality features such as record IDs, feature engineering, for example, deriving individual date parts from date-time features, and others. For more information about the pre-processing support in automated machine learning, see What is Automated Machine Learning from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to automate machine learning model selection with Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to use Azure Machine Learning's automated machine learning capabilities to determine the best performing algorithm for your data, use automated machine learning to pre-process data for training, and run an automated machine learning experiment. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to explore differential privacy. Data science projects, including machine learning projects, involve analysis of data, and often that data includes sensitive personal details that should be kept private. In practice, most reports that are published from the data include aggregations of the data, which you may think would provide some privacy. After all, the aggregated results do not reveal the individual data values. However, consider a case where multiple analyses of the data result in reported aggregations that, when combined, could be used to work out information about individuals in the source dataset. Suppose 10 participants share data about their location and salary, from which 2 reports are produced. An aggregated salary report that tells us the average salaries in New York, San Francisco, and Seattle. A worker location report that tells us that 10% of the study participants, in other words, a single person, is based in Seattle. From these 2 reports, we can easily determine the specific salary of the Seattle-based participant. Anyone reviewing both studies who happens to know a person from Seattle that participated now knows that person's salary. In this lesson, you'll explore differential privacy, a technique that can help protect an individual's data against this kind of exposure. More specifically, you will learn how to articulate the problem of data privacy, describe how differential privacy works, configure parameters for differential privacy, and perform differentially private data analysis. Differential privacy seeks to protect individual data values by adding statistical noise to the analysis process. The math involved in adding the noise is complex, but the principle is fairly intuitive. The noise ensures that data aggregations stay statistically consistent with the actual data values, allowing for some random variation, but make it possible to work out the individual values from the aggregated data. In addition, the noise is different for each analysis, so the results are non-deterministic. In other words, 2 analyses that perform the same aggregation may produce slightly different results. One way that an individual can protect their personal data is simply to not participate in a study. This is known as their opt-out option. However, there are a few considerations for this as a solution. Even if you decide to opt out of a study, it may still produce results that affect you. For example, you may choose to opt out of a study that compares the heart disease diagnoses across a couple of people on the basis that doing so may reveal a heart disease diagnosis that causes your health insurance premiums to rise. If the study finds a correlation between people who drink coffee and a higher risk of heart disease, and your insurance company knows that you are a coffee drinker, your rate may rise even though you didn't personally participate in the study. The benefits of participation in the study may outweigh any negative impact. For example, if you're paid $100 to participate in a study that results in your health insurance rate rising by $10 per year, it will be more than 10 years before you make a net loss. This may be a worthwhile trade-off to you, particularly if your rate may rise as a result of the study, even if you don't participate. The only way for the opt-out option to work for every individual is for every individual not to take part, which makes the whole study pointless. The amount of variation caused by adding noise is configurable through a parameter called epsilon. This value governs the amount of additional risk that your personal data can be identified through rejecting the opt-out option and participating in a study. The key thing is that it applies this privacy principle for everyone participating in the study. A low epsilon value provides the most privacy at the expense of less accuracy when aggregating the data. A higher epsilon value results in aggregations that are more true to the actual data distribution, but in which the individual contribution of a single individual to the aggregated value is less obscured by noise. In this lesson, you learned how to explore differential privacy. You learned how to articulate the problem of data privacy, describe how differential privacy works, configure parameters for differential privacy, and perform differentially private data analysis. To learn more about interpreting models, see differential privacy in the Azure Machine Learning documentation from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to these resources from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to explain machine learning models with Azure Machine Learning. As machine learning becomes increasingly integral to decisions that affect health, safety, economic well-being, and other aspects of people's lives, it's important to be able to understand how models make predictions and to be able to explain the rationale for machine learning-based decisions. Explaining models is difficult because of the range of machine learning algorithm types and the nature of how machine learning works. But model interpretability has become a key element of helping to make model predictions explainable. In this lesson, you will learn how to interpret global and local feature importance, use an explainer to interpret a model, create model explanations in a training experiment, and visualize model explanations. Model explainers use statistical techniques to calculate feature importance. This enables you to quantify the relative influence each feature in the training dataset has on label prediction. Explainers work by evaluating a test dataset of feature cases and the labels the model predicts for them. Global feature importance quantifies the relative importance of each feature in the test dataset as a whole. It provides a general comparison of the extent to which each feature in the dataset influences prediction. For example, a binary classification model to predict loan default risk might be trained from features such as loan amount, income, marital status, and age to predict a label of 1 for loans that are likely to be repaid and 0 for loans that have a significant risk of default and therefore shouldn't be approved. An explainer might then use a sufficiently representative test dataset to produce the following global feature importance values: income 0.98, loan amount 0.67, age 0.54, and marital status 0.32. It's clear from these values that in respect to the overall predictions generated by the model for the test dataset, income is the most important feature for predicting whether or not a borrower will default on a loan, followed by the loan amount, then age, and finally marital status. Local feature importance measures the influence of each feature value for a specific individual prediction. For example, suppose Sam applies for a loan which the machine learning model approves by predicting that Sam won't default on the loan repayment. You could use an explainer to calculate the local feature importance for Sam's application to determine which factors influence the prediction. Because this is a classification model, each feature gets a local importance value for each possible class, indicating the amount of support for that class based on the feature value. Since this is a binary classification model, there are only 2 possible classes, 0 and 1. Each feature's support for one class results in a correlatively negative level of support for the other. In Sam's case, the overall support for class 0 is minus 1.4, and the support for class 1 is correspondingly 1.4. So, support for class 1 is higher than for class 0, and the loan is approved. The most important feature for a prediction of class 1 is loan amount, followed by income. These are the opposite order from their global feature importance values, which indicate that income is the most important factor for the data sample as a whole. There could be multiple reasons why local importance for an individual prediction varies from global importance for the overall dataset. For example, Sam might have a lower income than average, but the loan amount in this case might be unusually small. For a multi-class classification model, a local importance values for each possible class is calculated for every feature, with the total across all classes always being 0. For example, a model might predict the species of a penguin based on features like its bill length, bill width, flipper length, and weight. Suppose there are 3 species of penguin, so the model predicts one of 3 class labels, 0, 1, or 2. For an individual prediction, the flipper length feature might have local importance values of 0.5 for class 0, 0.3 for class 1, and minus 0.8 for class 2. This indicated that the flipper length moderately supports a prediction for class 0, slightly supports a prediction of class 1, and it strongly supports the prediction of this particular penguin not being part of class 2. For a regression model, there are no classes, so the local importance values simply indicate the level of influence each feature has on the predicted scalar label. Hello and welcome. In this part, you will explore using explainers. You can use the Azure Machine Learning SDK to create explainers for models, even if they were not trained using an Azure Machine Learning experiment. To interpret a local model, you must install the Azure ML-interpret package and use it to create an explainer. There are multiple types of explainer, including Mimic Explainer, Tabular Explainer, and PFI Explainer. Let's look at these in a little more detail now. Mimic Explainer is an explainer that creates a global surrogate model that approximates your trained model and can be used to generate explanations. This explainable model must have the same kind of architecture as your trained model, for example, linear or tree-based. Tabular explainer is an explainer that acts as a wrapper around various SHAP explainer algorithms, automatically choosing the one that is most appropriate for your model architecture. PFI explainer is a permutation feature importance explainer that analyzes feature importance by shuffling feature values and measuring the impact on prediction performance. Okay, let's switch to global feature importance now. To retrieve global importance values for the features in your model, you can call the explain global method of your explainer to get a global explanation, and then use the get feature importance dict method to get a dictionary of the feature importance values. It's important to note that the code is the same for mimic explainer and tabular explainer. The PFI explainer requires the actual labels that correspond to the test features. Finally, let's look at explaining local feature importance. To retrieve local feature importance from a mimic explainer or a tabular explainer, you must call the explain local method of your explainer, specifying the subset of cases you want to explain. Then you can use the get ranked local names and get ranked local values methods to retrieve dictionaries of the feature names and importance values ranked by importance. It's important to note that the code is the same for mimic explainer and tabular explainer. The PFI explainer doesn't support local feature importance explanations. Model explanations in Azure Machine Learning Studio include multiple visualizations that you can use to explore feature importance. The first visualization on the Explanations tab for a run shows global feature importance. You can use the slider to show only the top K features. Switching to the Summary Importance visualization shows the distribution of individual importance values for each feature across the test dataset. You can view the features as a swarm plot, shown above, a box plot, or a violin plot. Selecting an individual data point shows the local feature importance for the case to which the data point belongs. In this lesson, you learned how to explain machine learning models with Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to interpret global and local feature importance, use an explainer to interpret a model, create model explanations in a training experiment, and visualize model explanations. To learn more about interpreting models, see Model Interpretability in Azure Machine Learning in the Azure Machine Learning documentation from the Microsoft website. You can find a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to detect and mitigate unfairness in models with Azure Machine Learning. Machine learning models are increasingly used to inform decisions that affect people's lives. For example, a prediction made by a machine learning model might influence approval for a loan, insurance, or other financial services, acceptance into a school or college course, eligibility for a medical trial or experimental treatment, inclusion in a marketing promotion, and selection for employment or promotion. With such critical decisions in the balance, confidence that the machine learning models we rely on predict and don't discriminate for or against subsets of the population based on ethnicity, gender, age, or other factors. In this lesson, you will learn how to evaluate machine learning models for fairness and mitigate predictive disparity in a machine learning model. When we consider the concept of fairness concerning predictions made by machine learning models, it helps to be clear about what we mean by fair. For example, suppose a classification model is used to predict the probability of successful loan repayment and therefore influences whether or not the loan is approved. The model will likely be trained using features that reflect the characteristics of the applicant, such as age, employment status, income, savings, and current debt. These features are used to train a binary classification model that predicts whether an applicant will repay the loan. Suppose the model predicts that around 45% of applicants will successfully repay their loans. However, on reviewing loan approval records, you begin to suspect that fewer loans are approved for applicants aged 25 or younger than for applicants who are over 25. How can you be sure the model is fair to applicants in both age groups? One way to start evaluating the fairness of a model is to compare predictions for each group with a sensitive feature. For the loan approval model, age is a sensitive feature that we care about, so we could split the data into subsets for each age group and compare the selection rate, the proportion of positive predictions for each group. Let's say we find that the model predicts that 36% of applicants aged 25 or younger will repay a loan, but it predicts successful repayments for 54% of applicants aged over 25. There's a disparity in predictions of 18%. At first glance, this comparison seems to confirm that there's bias in the model that discriminates against younger applicants. However, when you consider the population as a whole, it may be that younger people generally earn less than people more established in their careers, have lower levels of savings and assets, and have a higher rate of defaulting on loans. The important point to consider here is that just because we want to ensure fairness regarding age, it doesn't necessarily follow that age is not a factor in loan repayment probability. It's possible that in general, younger people are less likely to repay a loan than older people. To get the full picture, we need to look a little deeper into the predictive performance of the model for each subset of the population. When you train a machine learning model using a supervised technique like regression or classification, you use metrics achieved against holdout validation data to evaluate the overall predictive performance of the model. For example, you might evaluate a classification model based on accuracy, precision, or recall. To evaluate the fairness of a model, it's important to split data into subsets based on the sensitive features on which the population is grouped. Then, after applying the same predictive performance metrics, you can measure the disparity in those metrics across the subgroups. For example, suppose the loan approval model exhibits an overall recall metric of 0.67. In other words, it correctly identifies 67% of cases where the applicant repaid the loan. The question is whether or not the model provides a similar rate of correct predictions for different age groups. To find out, we group the data based on the sensitive feature, age, and measure the predictive performance metric, recall, for those groups. Then we can compare the metric scores to determine the disparity between them. Let's say that we find that the recall for validation cases where the applicant is 25 or younger is 0.50, and recall for cases where the applicant is over 25 is 0.83. In other words, the model correctly identified 50% of the people in the 25 or younger age group who successfully repaid a loan, and therefore misclassified 50% of them as loan defaulters, but found 83% of loan repayers in the older age group, misclassifying only 17% of them. The disparity in prediction performance between the groups is 33%, with the model predicting significantly more false negatives for the younger age group. When you find a disparity between prediction rates or prediction performance metrics across sensitive feature groups, it's worth considering potential causes. These might include data imbalance, indirect correlation, and societal biases. Let's take a closer look at each of these now. Some groups may be overrepresented in the training data, or the data may be skewed so that cases within a specific group aren't representative of the overall population. The sensitive feature itself may not be predictive of the label, but there may be a hidden correlation between the sensitive feature and some other feature that influences the prediction. For example, there's likely a correlation between age and credit history, and there's likely a correlation between credit history and loan defaults. If the credit history feature is not included in the training data, the training algorithm may assign a predictive weight to age without accounting for credit history, which might make a difference to loan repayment probability. Subconscious biases in the data collection, preparation, or modelling process may have influenced feature selection or other aspects of model design. Optimizing for fairness in a machine learning model is a socio-technical challenge. It's not always something you can achieve purely by applying technical corrections to a training algorithm. However, there are some strategies you can adopt to mitigate bias, including balanced training and validation data. You can apply oversampling or undersampling techniques to balance data and use stratified splitting algorithms to maintain representative proportions for training and validation. Perform extensive feature selection and engineering analysis. Make sure you fully explore the interconnected correlations in your data to try to differentiate features that are directly predictive from features that encapsulate more complex, nuanced relationships. Evaluate models for disparity based on significant features. You can't easily address the bias in a model if you can't quantify it. Trade off overall predictive performance for the lower disparity in predictive performance between sensitive feature groups. A model that is 99.5% accurate with comparable performance across all groups is often more desirable than a model that is 99.9% accurate but discriminates against a particular subset of cases. The rest of this module explores the Fair Learn package, a Python package that you can use to evaluate and mitigate unfairness in machine learning models. Fair Learn is a Python package that you can use to analyze models and evaluate disparity between predictions and prediction performance for one or more sensitive features. It works by calculating group metrics for the sensitive features you specify. The metrics themselves are based on standard scikit-learn model evaluation metrics such as accuracy, precision, or recall for classification models. The Fair Learn API provides multiple ways in detecting disparities in metrics across sensitive feature groupings. For a binary classification model, you might start by comparing the selection rate, the number of positive predictions for each group, by using the selection rate function. This function returns the overall selection rate for the test dataset. You can also use standard sklearn.metrics functions, such as accuracy score, precision score, or recall score, to get an overall view of how the model performs. Then you can define one or more sensitive features in your dataset with which you want to group subsets of the population and compare selection rate and predictive performance. FairLearn includes a metric frame function that enables you to create a data frame of multiple metrics by the group. For example, in a binary classification model for loan repayment prediction, where the sensitive feature age consists of two possible categorical values, 25 and under and over 25, you can then create a metric frame for these groups. It's often easier to compare metrics visually, so FairLearn provides an interactive dashboard widget that you can use in a notebook to display group metrics for a model. The widget enables you to choose a sensitive feature and performance metric to compare and then calculates and visualizes the metrics and disparity. FairLearn integrates with Azure Machine Learning by enabling you to run an experiment in which the dashboard metrics are uploaded to your Azure Machine Learning workspace. Hello. In this part, you will learn how to mitigate unfairness with FairLearn. In addition to enabling you to analyse disparity in selection rates and predictive performance across sensitive features, FairLearn provides support for mitigating unfairness in models. The mitigation support in FairLearn is based on the use of algorithms to create alternative models that apply parity constraints to produce comparable metrics across sensitive feature groups. FairLearn supports the following mitigation techniques. Exponentiated gradient, which is a reduction technique that applies a cost minimization approach to learning the optimal trade-off of overall predictive performance and fairness disparity. Grid search, which is a simplified version of the exponentiated gradient algorithm that works efficiently with small numbers of constraints. And finally, threshold optimizer, which is a post-processing technique that applies a constraint to an existing classifier, transforming the prediction as appropriate. It is important to note that all three techniques support binary classification and regression, while Threshold Optimizer only supports the binary classification model. The choice of parity constraint depends on the technique being used and the specific fairness criteria you want to apply. Constraints in FairLearn include demographic parity, true positive rate parity, false positive rate parity, equalized odds, error rate parity, and bounded group loss. Let's look at each of these a little more closely now. Use the demographic parity constraint with any of the mitigation algorithms to minimize disparity in the selection rate across sensitive feature groups. For example, in a binary classification scenario, this constraint tries to ensure that an equal number of positive predictions are made in each group. Use the true positive rate parity constraint with any of the mitigation algorithms to minimize disparity in true positive rate across sensitive feature groups. For example, in a binary classification scenario, this constraint tries to ensure that each group contains a comparable ratio of true positive predictions. Use the false positive rate parity constraint with any of the mitigation algorithms to minimize disparity in false positive rate across sensitive feature groups. For example, in a binary classification scenario, this constraint tries to ensure that each group contains a comparable ratio of false positive predictions. Use this constraint with any of the mitigation algorithms to minimize disparity in combined true positive rate and false positive rate across sensitive feature groups. For example, in a binary classification scenario, this constraint tries to ensure that each group contains a comparable ratio of true positive and false positive predictions. Use the error rate parity constraint with any of the reduction-based mitigation algorithms, exponentiated gradient and grid search, to ensure that the error for each sensitive feature group does not deviate from the overall error rate by more than a specified amount. Finally, use the bounded group loss constraint with any of the reduction-based mitigation algorithms to restrict the loss for each sensitive feature group in a regression model. A common approach to mitigation is to use one of the algorithms and constraints to train multiple models and then compare their performance, selection rate and disparity metrics to find the optimal model for your needs. Often, the choice of the model involves a trade-off between raw predictive performance and fairness, based on your definition of fairness for a given scenario. Generally, fairness is measured by a reduction in the disparity of feature selection, for example, ensuring that an equal proportion of members from each gender group is approved for a bank loan, or by a reduction in the disparity of performance metric, for example, ensuring that a model is equally accurate at identifying repayers and defaulters in each age group. FairLearn enables you to train mitigated models and visualize them using the dashboard. You can select an individual model in the scatter plot to see its details, enabling you to explore the options and select the best model for your fairness requirements. Just as when analysing an individual model, you can register all of the models found during your mitigation testing and upload the dashboard metrics to Azure Machine Learning. In this lesson, you learned how to build and operate machine learning solutions with Azure Machine Learning. You learned how to evaluate machine learning models for fairness and mitigate predictive disparity in a machine learning model. To learn more about FairLearn, see the FairLearn documentation on GitHub. You can find a link to these resources from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hello. In this lesson, you will learn how to monitor models with Azure Machine Learning. Application Insights is an application performance management service in Microsoft Azure. It enables the capture, storage and analysis of telemetry data from applications. You can use Application Insights to monitor telemetry from many kinds of application, including applications that are not running in Azure. All that's required is a low overhead instrumentation package to capture and send the telemetry data to Application Insights. The necessary package is already included in Azure Machine Learning Web Services, so you can use it to capture and review telemetry from models published with Azure Machine Learning. In this lesson, you will learn how to enable Application Insights monitoring for an Azure Machine Learning Web Service and capture and view model telemetry. In this section, you will learn how to enable Application Insights. To log telemetry and Application Insights from an Azure Machine Learning service, you must have an Application Insights resource associated with your Azure Machine Learning workspace, and you must configure your service to use it for telemetry logging. When you create an Azure Machine Learning workspace, you can select an Azure Application Insights resource to associate with it. If you do not select an existing Application Insights resource, a new one is created in the same resource group as your workspace. You can determine the Application Insights resource associated with your workspace by viewing the overview page of the Workspace blade in the Azure portal. Or you can use the Get Details method of a workspace object. Okay, let's now look at how to enable Application Insights for a service. When deploying a new real-time service, you can enable Application Insights in the deployment configuration for the service. If you want to enable Application Insights for a service that is already deployed, you can modify the deployment configuration for Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, based services in the Azure portal. Alternatively, you can update any web service by using the Azure Machine Learning SDK. In this lesson, you learned how to monitor models with Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to enable Application Insights monitoring for an Azure Machine Learning web service and capture and view model telemetry. To learn more about monitoring models with Azure Machine Learning, see Monitor and Collect Data from ML Web Service Endpoints in the Azure Machine Learning documentation. You can find a link to these resources from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Hi. In this lesson, you will learn how to monitor data drift with Azure Machine Learning. You typically train a machine learning model using a historical dataset that is representative of the new data that your model will receive for inferencing. However, over time, there may be trends that change the profile of the data, making your model less accurate. For example, suppose a model is trained to predict the expected gas mileage of an automobile based on the number of cylinders, engine size, weight, and other features. Over time, as car manufacturing and engine technologies advance, the typical fuel efficiency of vehicles might improve dramatically, making the predictions made by the model trained on older data less accurate. This change in data profiles between training and inferencing is known as data drift, and it can be a significant issue for predictive models used in production. It is therefore important to be able to monitor data drift over time and retrain models as required to maintain predictive accuracy. In this lesson, you will learn how to create a data drift monitor, schedule data drift monitoring, and view data drift monitoring results. Azure Machine Learning supports data drift monitoring through the use of datasets. You can capture new feature data in a dataset and compare it to the dataset with which the model was trained. It's common for organizations to continue to collect new data after a model has been trained. For example, a health clinic might use diagnostic measurements from previous patients to train a model that predicts diabetes likelihood, but continue to collect the same diagnostic measurements from all new patients. The clinic's data scientists could then periodically compare the growing collection of new data to the original training data and identify any changing data trends that might affect model accuracy. To monitor data drift using registered datasets, you need to register two datasets. a baseline dataset, which is usually the original training data, and a target dataset that will be compared to the baseline based on time intervals. This dataset requires a column for each feature you want to compare and a timestamp column so the rate of data drift can be measured. It's important to note that you can configure a deployed service to collect new data submitted to the model for inferencing, which is saved in Azure Blob Storage and can be used as a target dataset for data drift monitoring. See Collect Data from Models in Production in the Azure Machine Learning documentation for more information. You can find a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. After creating these datasets, you can define a dataset monitor to detect data drift and trigger alerts if the rate of drift exceeds a specified threshold. You can create dataset monitors using the visual interface in Azure Machine Learning Studio or by using the Data Drift Detector class in the Azure Machine Learning SDK. After creating the dataset monitor, you can backfill to immediately compare the baseline dataset to existing data in the target dataset, which backfills the monitor based on weekly changes in data for the previous 6 weeks. When you define a data monitor, you specify a schedule on which it should run. Additionally, you can specify a threshold for the rate of data drift and an operator email address for notifications if this threshold is exceeded. Data drift monitoring works by running a comparison at scheduled frequency and calculating data drift metrics for the features in the dataset that you want to monitor. You can define a schedule to run every day, week, or month. Data drift is measured using a calculated magnitude of change in the statistical distribution of feature values over time. You can expect some natural random variation between the baseline and target datasets, but you should monitor for large changes that might indicate significant data drift. You can define a threshold for data drift magnitude above which you want to be notified and configure alert notifications by email. For example, using Python code, you can schedule a data drift monitor to run every week and send an alert if the drift magnitude is greater than 0.3. In this lesson, you learned how to monitor data drift with Azure Machine Learning. More specifically, you learned how to create a data drift monitor, schedule data drift monitoring, and view data drift monitoring results. To learn more about monitoring data drift in Azure Machine Learning, see Detect Data Drift on Datasets and Detect Data Drift on Models Deployed to Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, in the Azure Machine Learning documentation. You can find a link to these resources from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. Congratulations on successfully completing this course. Build and operate machine learning solutions with Azure Machine Learning. In the next course, you'll learn how to perform data science with Azure Databricks. In this course, you'll explore the following lessons: Introduction to Azure Databricks, working with data in Azure Databricks, processing data in Azure Databricks, get started with Databricks and machine learning, manage machine learning life cycles and fine-tune models, and train a distributed neural network and serve models with Azure Machine Learning. You'll also work through several practical exercises to run data science workloads in the cloud. This course forms part of the preparation for the exam DP100, designing and implementing a data science solution on Azure. When you pass the DP100 exam, you earn the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Scientist Associate. Please remember to check out more information about the exam and make sure to read the material that follows for more information on what's to come next. Hello and welcome to this course, Perform Data Science with Azure Databricks. In this course, you will learn how to perform data science with Azure Databricks. This course is comprised of the following modules: Introduction to Azure Databricks, working with data in Azure Databricks, processing data in Azure Databricks, get started with Azure Databricks and machine learning, manage machine learning life cycles and fine-tune models, and train a distributed neural network and serve models with Azure Machine Learning. Let's start with the first module, Introduction to Azure Databricks. In this module, you will describe Azure Databricks and Apache Spark for processing huge files, and describe Spark architecture fundamentals. In the next module, you'll be working with data in Azure Databricks. Use Azure Databricks to read multiple file types, both with and without a schema. Combine inputs from files in data stores such as Azure SQL Database. Transform and store that data for advanced analytics. Process data in Azure Databricks by defining data frames to read and process the data, and perform data transformations in data frames and execute actions to display the transformed data. Up next, you will learn how to process data in Azure Databricks. In this module, you'll learn how to build and query a Delta Lake. Up next, you will get started with Azure Databricks and machine learning. In this module, you will understand the basics of machine learning and machine learning workflow. This module will cover performing machine learning with Azure Databricks and learn how to train a machine learning model. Up next, you will learn how to manage machine learning life cycles and fine-tune models. In this module, you will learn how to work with ML Flow in Azure Databricks and perform model selection with hyperparameter tuning. This will include how to use modules from PySpark's machine learning library for hyperparameter tuning. Up next, you will learn how to train a distributed neural network and serve models with Azure Machine Learning. In this module, you will understand deep learning with Horovod for distributed training and how to work with Azure Machine Learning to deploy serving models. Additionally, throughout this course, you'll have an opportunity to create and work with Azure Databricks through interactive exercises and real-world examples of data science in action, knowledge checks, and practice exams. Finally, you will prepare for the Microsoft Certified Associate Test by taking a practice exam. We wish you every success as you start this learning journey.
Welcome to the second lesson in this module. This lesson focuses on how Azure Databricks works with Apache Spark Notebook. In this lesson, you will develop an understanding of the Azure Databricks platform, create your own Azure Databricks workspace, create a notebook inside your home folder in Databricks, understand the fundamentals of Apache Spark Notebook, create or attach to a Spark cluster, and identify the types of tasks well suited to the unified analytics engine Apache Spark. Let's begin with a look at the Azure Databricks platform. Azure Databricks provides a notebook-oriented Apache Spark as a Service workspace environment. It offers data science and engineering teams a single platform to manage clusters and explore data interactively. Azure Databricks combines the power of Databricks, an end-to-end managed Apache Spark platform optimized for the cloud, and the enterprise scale and security of Microsoft's Azure platform in order to make it simple to run large-scale Spark workloads. Databricks was founded by the creators of Apache Spark, Delta Lake, and ML Flow to empower developers to accelerate AI and innovation by simplifying the process of building enterprise-grade production data applications. Today, over 2,000 global companies use the Databricks platform across the big data and machine learning lifecycle. Databricks' vision is to accelerate innovation by unifying data science, data engineering, and business using the big data analytics platform as the solution. The purpose of Azure Databricks is to address the problems encountered on other big data platforms. To avoid these, Azure Databricks was optimized from the ground up with a focus on performance and cost efficiency in the cloud. The Databricks runtime adds several key capabilities to Apache Spark workloads that can increase performance and reduce costs by as much as 10 to 100 times those of other platforms when running on Azure. These capabilities include high-speed connectors to Azure storage services such as Azure Blob Store and Azure Data Lake, auto-scaling and auto-termination of Spark clusters to minimize costs, caching and indexing, and advanced query optimization. By providing an optimized, easy-to-provision and configure environment, Azure Databricks gives developers a performant, cost-effective platform that enables them to spend more time building applications and less time focused on managing clusters and infrastructure. Let's take a closer look at how Azure Databricks works with the rest of the platform. As a compute engine, Azure Databricks sits at the center of your Azure-based software platform and provides native integration with Azure Data Services, machine learning, lifecycle management integrations, and machine learning runtime. One of Databricks' key advantages is the numerous offerings that are not open source Spark. These offerings include Databricks Workspace for interactive data science and collaboration, Databricks Workflows for production jobs and workflow automation, Databricks Runtime, Databricks I/O or DB.io, which is an optimized data access layer, Databricks Serverless, a fully managed auto-tuning platform, and Databricks Enterprise Security, also known as DBES, which provides end-to-end security and compliance. Next, let's look at how Apache Spark works with Azure Databricks. Spark is a unified processing engine that can analyze big data using SQL, machine learning, graph processing, or real-time stream analysis. At its core is the Spark engine. The Data Frames API provides an abstraction above resilient distributed datasets, or RDDs, while simultaneously improving performance 5 to 20 times over traditional RDDs with its Catalyst optimizer. Spark ML provides high-quality and finely tuned machine learning algorithms for processing big data. The Graph Processing API provides an easily approachable API for modeling pairwise relationships between people, objects, or nodes in a network. Finally, the Streaming APIs offers an end-to-end fault tolerance with exactly once semantics and the possibility for sub-millisecond latency. Besides running in many environments, Apache Spark also supports multiple languages. Scala is Apache Spark's primary language. The platform also runs Python, which is more commonly referred to as PySpark. Support also exists for R, known as Spark R or R on Spark, Java, and SQL. Note that SQL is closer to ANSI SQL 2003 compliance. It is now running all 99 Transaction Process Performance Council Decision Support Benchmarks, or TPC-DS queries. It offers a new standards-compliant parser with good error messages, subqueries, both correlated and uncorrelated, and approximate aggregate stats. And finally, with Data Frames API, the performance differences between languages are almost non-existent, especially for Scala, Java, and Python. In this lesson, you discovered the basics of Databricks Workspace and Apache Spark notebooks. Let's take a moment to recap what we learned. Azure Databricks offers data science and engineering teams a single platform to manage clusters and explore data interactively. Databricks boosts Apache Spark workloads by increasing performance and reducing costs, alongside other capabilities. Azure Databricks sits at the center of the Azure-based software platform and provides native integration with Azure services. Notebooks allow interaction with different types of data. They can be used to process huge data files, query, read, and write data from different sources, train machine learning models, and process live data streams. You can execute Python, Scala, SQL, and R code in a notebook cell. It is possible to create a Spark cluster and attach and detach it to or from a notebook. Azure Databricks plays a key role within the Azure ecosystem, and the Databricks file system, also known as DBFS, works to present blob storage as a file system. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. Open your required resource group and select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Welcome to the third and final lesson in this module. In this lesson, you will become familiar with the basic fundamentals of the Spark architecture. By the end of this lesson, you will understand the architecture of an Azure Databricks Spark cluster, and understand the architecture of a Spark job. Let's begin with an overview of the Azure Databricks environment and the characteristics of big data. As you may already know from previous lessons, Azure Databricks provides a notebook-oriented Apache Spark as a Service workspace environment. It is the most feature-rich hosted service available to run Spark workloads in Azure, a unified analytics engine for large-scale data processing and machine learning. Let's look at an example of when Spark architecture can be of assistance. Suppose you work with big data as a data engineer or a data scientist. Your work would involve processing data containing one or more of the following characteristics. High volume, processing an extremely large volume of data and scaling out your compute accordingly. High velocity, deploying streaming and real-time processing capabilities. And variety, utilizing a variety of data types from structured relational data sets and financial transactions to unstructured data such as chat and SMS messages, IoT devices, images, logs, and MRIs. These characteristics are often called the 3 V's of big data. When it comes to working with big data in a unified way, whether you process it real time as it arrives or in batches, Apache Spark provides a fast and capable engine that also supports data science processes like machine learning and advanced analytics. To gain a better understanding of how to develop with Azure Databricks, it is important to first understand the underlying architecture. 2 aspects we will look at include the Azure Databricks service and Apache Spark clusters. From a high level, the Azure Databricks service launches and manages Apache Spark clusters within your Azure subscription. Apache Spark clusters are groups of computers that are treated as a single computer and handle the execution of commands issued from notebooks. And using a master worker type architecture, clusters allow processing of data to be parallelized across many computers in order to improve scale and performance. An Apache Spark cluster consists of a Spark driver, which is known as the master. In Databricks, the notebook interface is the driver program, or master. It contains the main loop for the program and creates distributed data sets on the cluster. Databricks also consists of Spark clusters, or datasets, also known as workers. Databricks applies operations in the form of transformations and actions to the clusters. Typically, this involves the driver node sending work or tasks to the worker nodes. This assigns work to the slots, instructing them to pull data from a specified data source. Driver programs access Apache Spark through a Spark session object, regardless of deployment location. Microsoft Azure manages the cluster, auto-scaling it as needed based on both your usage and the setting used when configuring the cluster. Auto-termination can also be enabled. This allows Azure to terminate the cluster after a specified number of minutes of inactivity. Now let's take a closer look under the hood of the Databricks platform. When you create an Azure Databricks service, a Databricks appliance is deployed as an Azure resource in your subscription. And at the time of cluster creation, you specify the types and sizes of the virtual machines, also known as VMs, to use for both the driver and worker nodes. But Azure Databricks manages all other aspects of the cluster. You also have the option of using a serverless pool. A serverless pool is a self-managed pool of cloud resources that is auto-configured for interactive Spark workloads. You provide the minimum and maximum number of workers and the worker type, and Azure Databricks then provisions the compute and local storage based on your usage. The Databricks appliance is deployed into Azure as a managed resource group within your subscription. This resource group contains the driver and worker VMs, along with other required resources, including a virtual network and security group and a storage account. All metadata for your cluster, such as scheduled jobs, is stored in an Azure database with georeplication for fault tolerance. Internally, Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, is used to run the Azure Databricks control plane and data planes via containers. These containers run on the latest generation of Azure hardware, known as DV3 VMs. This hardware relies on non-volatile memory express, or NVMe, SSDs, capable of blazing 100 microseconds latency on I/O. These make Databricks I/O performance even better. And accelerated networking provides the fastest virtualized network infrastructure in the cloud. Azure Databricks utilizes these features to further improve Spark performance. Once the services within this managed resource group are ready, you can then manage the Databricks cluster through the Azure Databricks UI and through features such as auto-scaling and auto-termination. Users can integrate Databricks with a range of Microsoft Azure services. The control plane integrates with the Azure Resource Manager, where you can access storage, compute, network, and Microsoft Databricks RP services. Users can also interact with Databricks UX, which integrates with clusters and DBFS. The clusters and DBFS provide access to the Databricks workspace, and from here they integrate with VNet and blob storage. And the Azure Resource Manager can also integrate with the Databricks workspace. In the previous unit, we talked about the overall Azure Databricks architecture and added some context around the architecture of a Spark cluster. Before we break down these components in detail, let us summarize the fundamentals of a Spark architecture. As you may know, Spark is a distributed computing environment, and the unit of distribution is a Spark cluster. Every cluster has a driver and one or more executors, or workers. These are referred to as JVMs, or Java Virtual Machines. Work submitted to the cluster is split into as many independent jobs as needed. This is how work is distributed across the cluster's nodes. Jobs sent from the driver are further subdivided into tasks. The input to a job is split into one or more partitions. These partitions are the unit of work for each slot. And between tasks, partitions may need to be reorganized and shared over the network. Let's explore the cluster in more detail. The secret to Spark's awesome performance is parallelism. This is the ability to scale tasks or jobs horizontally into parallelized or distributed actions. This means we can simply add new nodes to the cluster almost endlessly without having to worry about limitations on memory and processing power. Previously, we would have had to scale tasks vertically, but vertical scaling is limited to a finite amount of RAM, threads, and CPU speeds. We parallelize at two levels, the first of which is the executor. This is a Java Virtual Machine, or JVM, running on a node. A JVM typically runs at a rate of one instance per node. The second level of parallelization is the slot. Each executor has several slots to which the driver can assign tasks for parallel execution. The number of slots is determined by the number of cores and CPUs of each node. The driver is the JVM in which our application runs. The JVM is naturally multi-threaded, but a single JVM, such as our driver, has a finite upper limit. However, the driver can work around these limits using slots. The driver assigns tasks to slots for parallel execution in order to overcome the limits of vertical scaling. In other words, the driver scales horizontally using slots. Depending on the work required, multiple jobs can be created, each of which can be broken down into stages. Additionally, the driver must also decide how to partition the data so that it can be distributed for parallel processing. Consequently, the driver assigns a partition of data to each task. In this way, each task knows which piece of data it is to process. Once started, each task will fetch from the original data source the partition of data assigned to it. The results of each job is then returned to the driver. Let's look at how Spark manages these clusters. At a much lower level, Spark Core employs a cluster manager that is responsible for provisioning nodes within the cluster. In each of these scenarios, the driver runs on one node, and each of the executors runs on its own individual node. However, thanks to Azure Databricks, you don't need to be concerned with cluster management, as Databricks provides a robust, high-performing cluster manager as part of its overall offerings. From a developer's perspective, your primary focus should be on the following: the number of partitions your data is divided into, the number of slots you have available for parallel execution, how many jobs you are triggering, and the stages those jobs are divided into. In this lesson, you explored Spark architecture fundamentals. Take a moment to review what you have learned. Azure Databricks provides a notebook-oriented Apache Spark as a Service workspace environment for large-scale data processing and machine learning. Azure Databricks can process the 3 V's: high volume, high velocity, and variety. Apache Spark clusters are groups of computers which manage and execute notebook commands. Spark functions through parallelism. This is when tasks are scaled horizontally into parallelized or distributed actions across nodes. You can continually add nodes to the cluster. Spark Core provisions nodes through a cluster manager. Each part of the cluster runs on its own individual node. Azure Databricks manages clusters through a high-performing cluster manager. Developers just need to focus on the number of partitions, slots, jobs, and stages. You now understand the fundamentals of Spark cluster and jobs architecture. This is a great starting point for learning how to perform data engineering and data science tasks in Azure Databricks. Welcome to the second module in this course. This module focuses on how to read and write data using Azure Databricks. In this module, you will use Azure Databricks to read multiple file types, both with and without a schema, combine inputs from files and data stores, such as Azure SQL Database, and transform and store that data for advanced analytics. So why is it important to be able to read and write data with the Azure Databricks platform? Consider the following example. Suppose you're working for a data analytics startup that's now expanding alongside its increasing customer base. The company receives large amounts of customer data from multiple sources in different raw formats. To efficiently handle this data, the company invests in Azure Databricks. Your team analyzes how Databricks supports day-to-day data handling functions such as reads, writes, and queries. And your team also performs these reads, writes, and queries to prepare the data for advanced analytics and machine learning operations. This module will help you to discover more about how to read, write, and query these various forms of data through a series of readings and exercises. You will need an Azure subscription to access the exercises. If you don't have an Azure subscription, visit azure.microsoft.com/free to create a free account. In this lesson, you explored how to read and write data in Azure Databricks. Take a moment to review what you have learned. Reading and writing data in Azure Databricks requires familiarity with CSV, JSON, and Parquet file formats. It is also important to be able to write Parquet files to the Databricks file system, or DBFS, with compression options. And the same dataframe.write method can be used to output to other formats. You have completed this module and now know how to read and write data in Azure Databricks. Well done. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the Resource Portal and open Resource Groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you have opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Welcome to the third module in this course. The first lesson explores working with data frames in Azure Databricks. In this lesson, you will use the count method to count rows in a data frame, use the display function to display a data frame in the notebook, cache a data frame for quicker operations if the data is needed a second time, and use the limit function to display a small set of rows from a larger data frame. And you will also use the select function to select a subset of columns from a data frame, use the distinct and drop duplicates functions to filter duplicate data, and use the drop method to remove columns from a data frame. So why is it important to be able to work with data frames on Azure Databricks platform? Consider the following example. Suppose you're working for a data analytics startup that's now expanding alongside its increasing customer base. The company receives large amounts of customer data from multiple sources in different raw formats. To efficiently handle this data, the company invests in Azure Databricks. Your team is responsible for analyzing how Databricks supports day-to-day data handling functions such as reads, writes, and queries. And you want to move beyond simple data handling functions and discover how to simplify data exploration and perform data transformations. The data exploration and transformation tasks help your team conduct advanced analytics and machine learning in later stages of the data pipeline. This lesson will help you to discover more about how to work with data frames through functions and transformations. You will explore these functions and transformations with a series of readings and exercises. You will need an Azure subscription to access the exercises. If you don't have an Azure subscription, visit azure.microsoft.com/free to create a free account. In this lesson, you learned how to work with data frames columns in Azure Databricks. Let's review the key points from this lesson. There is a specific syntax for specifying column values, for filtering and aggregations. It is important that all users of Azure Databricks understand how to correctly use the column class. All users must also know how to sort and filter a data frame based on column values. Finally, users of Azure Databricks should know how to use collect and take transformations to return records from a data frame and send these to the driver of the cluster. You have reached the end of this lesson on working with data frames columns in Azure Databricks. Well done. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you have opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Welcome to the lesson on building and querying a Delta Lake. After completing this module, you will be able to describe the key features and use cases of Delta Lake. Use Delta Lake to create, append, and upsert tables. Perform optimizations in Delta Lake. And compare different versions of a Delta table using Time Machine. So why is it important that we know how to build and query a Delta Lake? Consider a scenario where you're working as a data engineer or data scientist for a large retail store. Your organization uses Azure Data Lake to store all its online shopping data. However, as the volume of data increases, updating and querying information from storage is becoming more and more time-consuming. Your responsibility is to investigate the problem and find a solution. You need a solution that matches Data Lake in its scalability, but is also reliable and fast. Delta Lake can solve your problem. Delta Lake is a file format that integrates with Spark and has both open source and managed offerings. Delta Lake is provided as a managed offering as part of your Azure Databricks account and helps you combine the best capabilities of Data Lake, data warehousing, and a streaming ingestion system. By the end of this lesson, you will have developed the skill sets required to build and query a Delta Lake. Let's begin by describing the open source offering of Delta Lake. Delta Lake is a transactional storage layer designed specifically to work with Apache Spark and Databricks file system, DBFS. It maintains a transaction log that efficiently tracks changes to the table. A data lake is a storage repository that inexpensively stores a vast amount of raw data, both current and historical. Data is stored in native formats, such as XML, JSON, CSV, and Parquet. It may contain operational relational databases with live transactional data. Enterprises spend millions of dollars getting data into data lakes with Apache Spark. The aspiration is to do data science and machine learning on all that data using Apache Spark. But the data is not ready for data science and machine learning. Most of these projects are failing due to unreliable data. Why are these projects struggling with reliability and performance? The challenge is to extract meaningful information from data lakes. To do this reliably, you must solve problems such as schema enforcement when new tables are introduced, table repairs when any new data is inserted into the data lake, frequent refreshes of metadata, bottlenecks of small file sizes for distributed computations, and difficulty sorting data by an index if data is spread across many files and partitioned. There are also data reliability challenges with data lakes. Failed production jobs leave data in a corrupt state requiring tedious recovery. Lack of schema enforcement creates inconsistent and low-quality data, and lack of consistency makes it almost impossible to mix appends and reads, batch, and streaming. As great as data lakes are at inexpensively storing our raw data, they also bring with them performance challenges. Too many small or very big files means more time opening and closing files rather than reading contents, and this is even worse with streaming. Partitioning, also known as poor man's indexing, breaks down if you picked the wrong fields or when data has many dimensions, high cardinality columns, and no caching. Cloud storage throughput is low. Cloud object storage is 20 to 50 megabits a second core versus 300 megabits a second core for a local source. Delta Lake is a file format that can help you build a data lake comprised of one or many tables in Delta Lake format. Delta Lake integrates tightly with Apache Spark and uses an open format that is based on Parquet. Because it is an open source format, Delta Lake is also supported by other data platforms, including Azure Synapse Analytics. Delta Lake specializes in making data ready for analytics. Delta Lake is an open-source storage layer that brings ACID transactions to Apache Spark and big data workloads. You can read and write data that's stored in Delta Lake by using Apache Spark SQL Batch and streaming APIs. These are the same familiar APIs that you use to work with Hive tables or DBFS directories. Let's take a look at the functionality Delta Lake provides. Data lakes typically have multiple data pipelines reading and writing data concurrently. And data engineers must go through a tedious process to ensure data integrity due to the lack of transactions. Delta Lake brings ACID transactions to your data lakes. It provides serializability, which is the strongest isolation level. In big data, even the metadata itself can be big data. Delta Lake can avail of scalable metadata handling, which treats metadata just like data. It does this by leveraging Spark's distributed processing power to handle all its metadata. And as a result, Delta Lake can efficiently handle petabyte-scale tables with billions of partitions and files. The ability to undo a change or go back to a previous version is one of the key features of transactions. With its time travel feature, Delta Lake provides snapshots of data, enabling you to revert to earlier versions of data for audits, rollbacks, or to reproduce experiments. Apache Parquet is the baseline format for Delta Lake, enabling you to leverage the efficient compression and encoding schemes that are native to the format. A table in Delta Lake is both a batch table as well as a streaming source and sink. Streaming data ingest, batch historic backfill, and interactive queries all just work out of the box. Schema enforcement helps ensure that the data types are correct and required columns are present, preventing bad data from causing data inconsistency. Delta Lake enables you to make changes to a table schema that can be applied automatically without having to write migration DDL. Delta Lake transaction log records details about every change made to data, providing a full audit trail of the changes. Delta Lake supports Scala, Java, Python, and SQL APIs for a variety of functionality. Support for merge, update, and delete operations helps you to meet compliance requirements. Developers can use Delta Lake with their existing data pipelines with minimal change, since it is fully compatible with existing Spark implementations. For full documentation of the main features, see the Delta Lake documentation page and the Delta Lake project at GitHub. At the end of this module, there is a further resources reading that gives you all the links you need, including links to code snippets for merge, update, and delete DML commands. You now know about building and querying a Delta Lake. If you're looking for a data management system that's fast, reliable, and able to handle large volumes of data in different raw formats, Delta Lake is the solution. Delta Lake specializes in making data ready for analytics. It provides you with the best of data lake, data warehousing, and streaming data ingestion systems. Well done. You are on your way to mastering Delta Lake. In the next lesson, you will see how to process batch and streaming data and learn how Delta Lake architecture enables unified streaming and batch analytics. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you have opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group.
Suppose you're working for a data analytics startup that's now expanding along with its increasing customer base. You receive customer data from multiple sources in different raw formats. To efficiently handle huge amounts of customer data, your company has decided to invest in Azure Databricks. Your team is responsible for preparing the data for advanced analytics and machine learning operations. As part of feature engineering, there are specific column-level transformations you need to perform that are not supported by the built-in functions. You are looking to see how user-defined functions, or UDF, can help you achieve your complex and custom data processing logic. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium 14 Days Free Databricks Units, or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will learn how to create user-defined functions, or UDFs, and articulate performance advantages of vectorized UDFs in Python. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account from the Microsoft website. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. User-defined functions in Azure Databricks help you move beyond built-in functions in the SQL.Functions library. UDFs allow you to encapsulate your complex and custom data processing logic. As a result, UDFs make custom logic reusable, easy to understand, maintain, and debug. Now that you've concluded this lesson, you should know how to write, register, and invoke UDFs, write, register, and invoke vectorized UDFs, and articulate performance advantages of vectorized UDFs. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for an online retail store. Your organization uses Azure Data Lake to store all its online shopping data, and the data engineering team is already using Azure Databricks for day-to-day data handling operations. Your team has been tasked with exploring machine learning techniques to improve predictive models for customer churn. Your responsibility is to educate the rest of the team on the basics of machine learning, establish a development process the team should adopt as they embark on this new project. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium 14 Days Free Databricks Units, or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will understand the basics of machine learning, understand the machine learning workflow, and learn how to use Azure Databricks and PySpark library to implement key parts of the machine learning workflow: exploratory data analysis, modeling, and evaluation. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned the basics of machine learning and learned how to use PySpark's machine learning package to build key parts of the machine learning workflow that include exploratory data analysis, model training, and model evaluation. Now that you have concluded this lesson, you should know how to define machine learning, differentiate supervised and unsupervised tasks, identify regression and classification tasks, train a model, interpret the results and create predictions, and identify the main objectives of exploratory analysis. You also learned how to calculate statistical moments to determine the center and spread of data, create plots of data including histograms and scatter plots, calculate correlations between variables, and explore more advanced plots to visualize the relation between variables. Finally, you learned how to define the data analytics development cycle, motivate and perform a split between training and test data, train a baseline model, and evaluate a baseline model's performance and improve it. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for a bike share company. Your organization uses Azure Data Lake to store all its historical usage data for New York City. You are responsible for developing a machine learning-based regression model to predict seasonal bike rental demand for New York City. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium 14 days free Databricks units or DPUs, to give the workspace access to free premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will learn how to understand the three main building blocks in the PySpark's machine learning library: transformers, estimators, and pipelines. Learn how to build pipelines for common data featureization tasks, and deep dive into regression modeling. That includes training and interpreting a trained regression model. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to use PySpark's machine learning package to build featureization pipelines, train and interpret a simple regression model, and train a multivariate regression model. Now that you have concluded this lesson, you should know how to differentiate Spark transformers, estimators, and pipelines, one-hot encode categorical features, impute missing data, and combine different featureization stages into a pipeline. You also learned how to train a simple regression model, interpret regression models, and train a multivariate regression model. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for a bike share company. Your team has started experimenting with machine learning algorithms to predict seasonal bike rental demand. Your team realizes that managing the machine learning workflow is challenging because of difficulty in tracking various experiments, ensuring that experiments are reproducible, and providing a standard way to package and deploy trained models. You have been tasked to investigate frameworks for managing the machine learning lifecycle with minimal changes to integrate with your existing codebase. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium 14 days free Databricks units or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will learn how to use MLflow to track experiments, log metrics, and compare runs. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you've learned how to work with MLflow in Azure Databricks, or more specifically, learned how to use MLflow to track experiments, log metrics, and compare runs. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for a bike share company. Your team has started experimenting with machine learning algorithms to predict seasonal bike rental demand. The initial experiments are showing that the model performs well on the training dataset. However, the performance degrades as you test the model on new unseen data. Your next task is to fine-tune the model so that it generalizes and prevents overfitting the training dataset. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium, 14 days free Databricks units or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free Premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute costs. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will learn how to understand hyperparameter tuning and its role in machine learning, and learn how to use modules from PySpark's machine learning library for hyperparameter tuning and model selection. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to use PySpark's machine learning library for hyperparameter tuning and validation techniques to help select the best performing model. Now that you've concluded this lesson, you should know how to define hyperparameters and motivate their role in machine learning, tune hyperparameters using grid search, validate model performance using cross-validation, and save a trained model and its predictions. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks lessons, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other lessons. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Welcome back. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for a large online retail store. You have trained a deep learning model using TensorFlow and a subset of the available training data on a single node GPU machine to predict customer churn. Now you are ready to train the next iteration of the model using all available training data. However, you realize that training time on a single node will be in the order of weeks. Your next task is to look for open source frameworks that support distributed training of deep learning models that is both high performing and easy to use. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium, 14 days free Databricks units or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free Premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will learn how you can use Azure Databricks and how to run long-running distributed deep learning training jobs on Spark, and use Petastorm to enable training and evaluation of deep learning models from datasets in Apache Parquet format. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to use Azure Databricks and Horovod Runner to run distributed deep learning workloads. You learned how to shard the training data using both Pandas data frame as well as Parquet files with Petastorm. Finally, you put your knowledge to the test by completing an exercise that required you to build a model and distribute the deep learning training process using both Horovod Runner and Petastorm. Now that you've concluded this lesson, you should know how to use Horovod to train a distributed neural network and use Horovod to train a distributed neural network using Parquet files and Petastorm. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Imagine that you work as a data scientist for a large online retail store. Your team conducted research and decided on adopting Azure Machine Learning as the platform for machine learning lifecycle management. You have been tasked to understand how Azure Machine Learning supports operationalizing machine learning models. You want to research approaches to deploy and test your models as a scoring web service both in development and in production. You also want to understand how to update models that are already deployed in production. This module's labs can be completed for free using the Databricks 14-day trial, but you cannot use an Azure free trial subscription to create a Databricks trial workspace. To switch a free trial subscription to pay-as-you-go, go to your profile and change your subscription offer to pay-as-you-go. When you create your Azure Databricks workspace, you can select the trial pricing tier, Premium 14 days free Databricks units or DBUs, to give the workspace access to free premium Azure Databricks DBUs for 14 days. Please note, with a free workspace and free DBUs, you are still responsible for compute cost. In many cases, this means you will want to create clusters with a maximum of one node, regardless of the instructions of the individual labs. In this lesson, you will use mlflow.azure.ml package and Azure Machine Learning Python Software Development Kit, or SDK, to create or load Azure Machine Learning, or ML workspace. Register the MLflow model with Azure ML and build container image deployment. Deploy the model to Azure Container Instance, or ACI. Deploy the model to Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS. Test your model deployments and update model deployment in AKS. Before you begin, please ensure you have an Azure subscription. If you don't have an Azure subscription, create a free account. There is a link to this resource from the additional readings at the end of this lesson. In this lesson, you learned how to use Azure Databricks, MLflow, and Azure Machine Learning Python SDK to register trained models with Azure Machine Learning Service. You learned how to build container images that can be deployed as a scoring web service to either ACI for development and test, and then subsequently to AKS to support production applications. As you develop newer versions of your model, you also learn how to update an existing AKS deployment. Now that you have concluded this lesson, you should know how to serve models with Azure Machine Learning. If you plan on completing other Azure Databricks modules, don't delete your Azure Databricks instance yet. You can use the same environment for the other modules. However, if you do want to delete the Azure Databricks instance, then complete the following steps. Navigate to the resource portal and open resource groups. Locate and select the required resource group. When you've opened your required resource group, select Delete Resource Group. Type in the name of the resource group to be deleted in order to confirm the deletion. The Azure Studio acknowledges your confirmation and deletes the selected resource group. Congratulations on successfully completing this course. Perform data science with Azure Databricks. In the next course, you will recap the key topics covered in this program and take a full practice exam to better prepare you for the final exam. In this course, you will explore certification and exam preparation, complete 4 practice exams, and a final practice exam. This course forms part of the preparation for the exam DP100, Designing and Implementing a Data Science Solution on Azure. When you pass the DP100 exam, you earn the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Scientist Associate. Please remember to check out more information about the exam and make sure to read the material that follows for more information on what's to come next.